What happens to an angel when it falls not for pride but for love? Beneath a sky older than memory, before time was time, there were whispers not among men but among stars. There, in the breathless silence between God's command and creation's unfolding, stood beings not born of earth, angels, watchers. They stood at the edge of the eternal veil, not blinking, not doubting, only watching, waiting. They were not made to speak. They were made to witness, but something shifted. The winds beneath the throne grew heavy. The veil between heaven and earth thinned, and somewhere beneath the heavens a scent rose from clay, not of rebellion but of longing, the scent of human breath in winter, of skin kissed by dust, of hearts that bled for something they didn't yet understand. And the angels watched, not with arrogance, but with ache. What does an angel do when its purpose is only to see and not to touch? What happens to a divine creature when it begins to hunger not for glory but for something forbidden, something warm, something fleeting? The stars do not answer such questions, but the silence does. Come closer. There is a story that was once only told in trembling, a tale older than temples whispered between stones. The watchers, the angels who fell not with horns but with hearts. They did not defy God in defiance, they fell in desire, and their fall tore heaven open. Tonight, if your soul is tired, if the world has grown too loud, if sleep is waiting at your door, then sit near. Let the night breathe through you. Let the sky remember. Let this story unfold like ancient parchment unrolling beneath sacred hands. For what you're about to hear is not legend, it is memory. The wind was not yet born. The stars held their breath. And in the folds of heaven's golden veil there stood a silence so pure it could bruise the heart. This was before the fire was taught to burn, before man knew the names of the rivers, before even the dust of the earth had been stirred to shape a soul. And in that silence they watched. They were not called angels then, not as we know them, nor were they rebels. They were simply the watchers, noble, radiant, terrifying in beauty, sentinels of a sacred stillness. Each one fashioned not from earth or flame, but from the obedience of light itself. They stood on the threshold between realms, on that trembling line where eternity peers into the passage of time. Neither above nor below, only between, and they watched. They saw the earth unroll like a scroll beneath their gaze. Mountains rose from the chest of the deep. Waters whispered their first songs. Trees stretched heavenward without knowing why. And then there was man, not kings, not warriors, not sages, just man, fragile, breakable, bewildered by his own breath. The watchers felt no envy, only awe. They saw how the clay breathed, how the soul was poured like oil into bone, how love made its home in trembling flesh. And it moved something inside them, something ancient, something not spoken aloud. They had names the stars once knew: Samiaza, Azazel, Arakiel. Names not carved into scripture but whispered by wind over forgotten stones. Leaders among the watchers, stronger, stranger, still obedient but beginning to wonder. For what is wonder if not the first echo of desire? And still they watched. They watched the way men held their children, how women danced between dusk and dawn, how prayer rose from earth like smoke seeking its fire. They watched not out of lust. No, that word had not yet stained the heavens. They watched with longing, the kind that bruises slowly like light pressing against glass. Above them the throne remained veiled. The angels closest to it never questioned, never turned their gaze. But the watchers were not near the throne. They were stationed here in the in-between. And in the in-between, something sacred slipped. There were no horns, no cries of rebellion, only breath, only silence. A silence so heavy it sank through their wings. Samiaza, the leader, began to speak less. He no longer sang with the others. He would stand alone at the edge of the firmament, watching the daughters of man move like rivers through the valleys, not with lustful eyes but with something more dangerous, with yearning, not for their bodies but for their lives. He would speak to the others in hushed tones, like a prophet whose vision burns through the veil but cannot bear to name what he saw. "Do you feel it?" he asked one evening, his voice like twilight on the wind. Azazel did not answer, but his silence spoke. Arakiel turned away, afraid even to meet his gaze. For what Samyaza stirred in them was not a command but a mirror. In the heavens, obedience is music. It echoes, it returns. But down below, choice lives, and with it, consequence. The watchers were made to witness, not to weep. And yet many of them had begun to feel something they had no name for, a trembling, a hunger. They saw how fleeting human life was, how a child grew only to bury his father, how a mother's hair silvered with sorrow, how love bloomed in the shadow of death. The watchers had known eternity, but never loss. And perhaps that was the curse or the gift. For to watch something die and still love it, that is the kind of beauty even heaven cannot hold for long. And so heaven grew quiet, not in judgment, not yet, but in waiting. It is said that the first sin was pride, but before pride there was ache, and before ache there was silence. A silence so deep it began to shatter wings. One night Samyaza walked to the edge of the veil where the sky kisses the first breath of earth. He did not cross it, not yet. He placed his hand upon the invisible barrier, that thin, holy skin between heaven and mortality. And he whispered, "What is this feeling if not love?" He waited for the stars to answer, but they only watched him as he had once watched, and still the silence did not break. Beneath him a woman gathered water from a river. Her song rose like mist through the trees. Her child clung to her side. Her hair caught the wind. Her soul lit up the dusk like a candle. She did not see him, but he saw her. And it was in that moment, not of desire but of devotion, that the first crack appeared in the heavens. A tear that did not yet fall, but would, soon, very soon. The veil was still intact, but thinner now, like breath on cold glass. And behind it, angels trembled without moving. Samyaza no longer stood alone at the edge. One by one the other watchers gathered, not by command, but by pull. Something unspoken lived in the air now, like a wind with no direction. A longing they shared, yet dared not name. Azazel was the first to speak again. His voice did not rise, it dropped like a stone into sacred waters. She looked at the sky today and smiled. No one asked to, it didn't matter, any one of them could have said the same. These daughters of men, they lived with laughter wrapped in sorrow, with light in their hands even as darkness followed their steps. They bled, they birthed, they broke, and still they sang. The angels had watched the divine breathe life into Adam. They had bowed as commanded, but this was different. The love between man and woman was not a command, it was choice, and it shattered the watcher's understanding of heaven. Samyaza began to speak dreams in the night, dreams he should not have dreamed, of walking the earth barefoot, of holding a child, of feeling pain and earning joy, of aging beside a woman who looked not with reverence but with love. He no longer desired worship, he desired belonging. It was not rebellion, it was hunger. But hunger in heaven festers, and beneath their wings the watchers began to burn not with fire but with ache, a yearning to become what they were never made to be. Azazel, whose brilliance once lit the morning sky, began crafting thoughts of gifts. If we were to step across, he whispered, we could teach them. Samyaza turned to him, eyes lit with starlight. Teach them what? Azazel paused. The secrets we were entrusted with, fire, steel, the language of the heavens, beauty, war. Enchantment, the order of stars. Samyaza's gaze fell. You would give them fire, I would give them power, but they are not ready. Azazel's face darkened, and who decides that? We watch them suffer while heaven stays silent. Perhaps we were never meant to be only watchers. The silence between them deepened, not peaceful now, but sharp, like a blade that had never been drawn until today. Some angels turned away, clinging to obedience. Others looked down upon the earth and wept not for themselves, but for what they could not become. It is a terrible thing to witness beauty and be forbidden to touch it. And so, in the stillness of one moonless night, Samyaza gathered the watchers beneath the high place of Ardes, a mountain older than the flood, whose name is now dust. There were 200 of them, each one glowing like a fallen star, each one burning from within. He stood before them, wings folded, voice as steady as thunder behind clouds. If we cross, there is no return. No one answered. If we descend, we break the order of heaven. Still silence. But if we stay, he whispered, we will watch them die, never knowing love, never knowing what we could have been together. He stepped down from the stone and looked each one in the eye. I will not command, but I will go. A murmur not of rebellion, but of choice, and one by one they stepped forward. Azazel, Arakiel, Ramiel, Sariel, names now cursed in the winds of time. Names once clothed in light. They made a pact, a solemn vow that bound them in eternity. If we fall together. And the veil wept. It did not shatter, not yet, but it knew. Heaven always knows before it speaks. That night the stars were quieter, the throne said nothing. The higher angels, those who stood near God's breath, turned their faces away. For what can heaven say to those who choose love over obedience? The watchers, now bound, no longer belonged in the skies, but they had not yet descended. They stood on the precipice of the world, hearts torn between heaven's silence and earth's song, and below the daughters of men danced, unaware. Their laughter echoed in the valley like prayers that never knew they were heard. Samiaza watched a young woman tending a small fire. Her eyes reflected the stars, though she did not know their names. She sang while weaving cloth. Her fingers bore cuts, her feet were caked in earth. She looked up once as if sensing something, but she saw nothing. And yet he felt seen. He closed his eyes and whispered what no angel should ever whisper, "Ya Rab, forgive me." Not for sin, but for the love that would break him. He knew what was coming, not flames, not swords, but consequence. To choose love is to choose pain, and angels were not made to endure it. Yet here they stood between silence and song, between command and compassion, between eternity and one single irreversible fall. The moon rose full and silver, bearing witness. He would wait one more night, just one. For once the first foot crossed the veil, all of heaven would weep. And the watchers would no longer be just that. They would become fallen. It happened without trumpet, without thunder, without the heavens tearing open in rage. The fall was quieter than anyone could have imagined. One step. That was all it took. The air did not crack, the earth did not scream. Only a hush so deep it sounded like eternity turning its face. Samiaza stepped forward, first onto wind, then onto soil. And in that instant the heavens, not visibly but within, broke. The veil did not tear, it dissolved. No fire came, no wing was clipped. No voice from the throne descended with fury, only absence. He was no longer in heaven, nor yet of earth. He was other. The watchers followed him, 200 in total. One by one the mighty left their stations. Some hesitated, glancing skyward as if hopping for some last sign, a whisper, a warning, a tear, but none came, and so they fell, not like stars, not with screams, but like prayers unsaid, like petals torn too early from a sacred bloom. When their feet touched the soil, their wings changed, no longer bright with pure obedience, but dimmed as if the light had folded inward. They could still fly. But they would never rise again. The watchers wept. Not from shame that hadn't yet found them, but from the ache of the unknown, of what they had chosen, of what had chosen them in return, and the earth welcomed them. It did not resist. It did not recoil. It had been made from mercy after all. It had been touched by the divine, and now, once again, it was being touched by those who once stood near God's breath. But the heavens turned silent. The great angels, those who had not moved, those who remained veiled and holy, they did not speak. They did not curse. They simply stopped watching. The watchers were no longer theirs. In the valleys, the women began to see them, not as gods, not as monsters, but as men whose eyes burned with memory too ancient to name. Samiaza approached the one whose song had first undone him. She stood at the edge of the water, not frightened, not running. Her gaze met his like twilight meeting dusk, soft, inevitable, trembling. He spoke not with lips but with presence, and she understood. Azazel brought gifts, finely shaped blades, secrets of binding metals, the art of dyeing cloth in colors that never fade. He whispered to men how to mold beauty and destruction with equal hands. They called it knowledge. They called it blessing. They did not yet see the curse. Others taught stars, enchantments, rootcraft, charms. What once was sacred now became accessible. The angels were giving what was forbidden not in rage but in romance. They took wives, not all at once, but over days, moon cycles, and from those unions came children, not entirely human, not entirely divine. Giants they were called later, Nephilim, men of renown, beings whose shadows were too large for earth yet too small for heaven. They bore strength that cracked the mountains, voices that shook the caves, eyes that remembered the throne but had never seen it. The watchers loved them, for they were the fruit of their love, proof that even angels could create something beyond themselves. But with creation came consequence. The children were not holy, they were not wicked, they were unsustainable. Their hunger grew, not for love, but for dominion. The blood in their veins was not content with worship. It needed rule, and the world began to shift. The peace of the earth trembled. The balance of creation tilted. And the veil, it wept again. The higher angels looked upon the earth not with hatred but with grief. Their brothers had not fallen in fire, they had fallen in feeling, and for heaven that was far more dangerous. God did not shout, but the silence grew louder. The watchers noticed it. Their prayers no longer echoed. Their dreams no longer lit with divine scent. Their children no longer wept in the same way. They had been cut off, not cursed, not yet, but severed. They began to forget what heaven felt like. That was the true punishment, not flames, not wrath, but memory slipping away. Samyaza would sit beneath the trees and stare at the stars. He no longer knew their names. He had once placed them in their constellations. Now they looked down on him like strangers. Azazel grew bitter. "If we have been forgotten," he whispered, "then let us be gods instead." But gods do not mourn, and Samyaza still did. He would hold his child born of earth and heaven and feel nothing but ache, not regret, but a longing that had no place in the world. He missed the silence of heaven, even though it had never spoken to him. One night, as the wind rose and the valley slept, a shadow passed overhead, unseen, unheard, but felt. It was not a watcher, it was something greater. Heaven had begun to move, and judgment was waking. Still, no word was spoken. But far above, beyond stars and light, the throne stirred, and all of creation held its breath. There is a place beyond the stars where no eye has lingered. Not even the angels speak of it, for it is where silence was born. It lies beneath the throne, not in distance but in purity. A realm woven from remembrance and mercy, where every tear fallen on earth is stored in vessels only God can touch. It is there the sorrow of the heavens first gathered. They called it the Hall of Ashes. Not because it burned, but because it mourned. For heaven does not rage as men do. When the divine is grieved, it grieves in stillness. The Hall of Ashes was not made for wrath, it was made for witness. It holds the sorrow of prophets, the sighs of mothers, the final breath of the slain, the broken vow of angels. And now it stirred. One by one, the archangels gathered near its edge, not with wings spread, but with faces lowered, not in council, but in silence. Michael stood like a mountain wrapped in dusk, the guardian of sustenance, whose hands had carried provision through countless worlds. His eyes, once firm and calm, now dimmed with a grief too ancient to name. Beside him, Israfel, the bearer of the trumpet, leaned into the stillness like one who hears something not yet spoken. His hand trembled, though he did not lift it. The trumpet still slept across the veil, but its breath was stirring. And then came Jibril, not in thunder, not in wind, but like a prayer too sacred for lips. The angel of revelation, of messages so holy that the mountains once bowed when he passed. He stood at the center of the hall, wings tucked close like folded stars. He said nothing. There was no need, for all of them felt it, the fracture, not of command, but of creation. It is said that the throne itself is beyond time, untouched by emotion, encircled by light beyond light. But beneath it, where the ash gathers, the pain of the world leaves its trace. The watchers had not defied heaven with violence. They had done something more devastating. They had loved wrongly, and now creation bent under that weight. The Nephilim walked the earth like myths given bone, too large for the valleys, too restless for the sky. Some grew kind, curious, others cruel. All were misplaced. They sang songs in languages not taught. They carved symbols into stone that no man understood. They taught mortals to speak to stars, to bend plants into potions, to read the sky like scripture. And they began to forget God. For when you are born of angels, worship feels redundant. You carry the scent of heaven in your bones, and that sometimes becomes a curse. Down below, the watchers grew weary. Their children's power unsettled the world. Mountains no longer stood still. Seas whispered secrets they were never meant to know. Men began to fashion gods in their image, tall, mighty, terrible. The watchers saw it, and they wept. But heaven did not answer, not yet. For in the hall of ashes, sorrow must reach its fullness before judgment is born. Jibril stepped forward. He did not kneel, he did not shout, he whispered. One word, only the throne heard it. And the silence deepened not with absence, but with waiting. Elsewhere, in realms unseen, angels began moving without sound. Messengers were dispatched, not to warn the watchers, but to gather witness. Creation was watching its own unraveling. And God had not yet spoken, but something shifted. The veil, long forgotten, began to heal itself, not to welcome the fallen, but to protect what was left behind. And the watchers felt it. They could no longer ascend, even if they tried. The sky had closed. The covenant was broken, not by God, but by them. And below, the earth groaned beneath the weight of the Nephilim. Some of the giants devoured entire fields in a day. Others struck down whole villages with their laughter. The balance of creation wavered. Blood cried from the soil. And still, the watchers loved them, for a parent's heart does not know how to curse its child. Samyaza, once radiant, now walked with eyes sunken from grief. His beloved, the woman whose song first awakened him, had aged. She died in the night, her soul lifted in silence. He held her hand as it cooled. No fire, no miracles, only loss. Buried her beneath a tree they had once sat beneath, and his tears carved rivers into the earth. Azazel no longer brought gifts. He taught weapons now, sharpened thought, forged blade, divided men. His bitterness had found a new shape. If we are cursed, he said, then let us be the storm. But Samyaza only mourned. He wandered the hills like a ghost wrapped in fallen light. He would watch the Nephilim play, some kind, some cruel, and wonder what price he had paid for love. The hall of ashes echoed. Not with voices, but with the memory of what had been. Mikael turned his gaze upward. Israfil placed a hand on his trumpet, and Jibril, he waited. The throne was not angry, it was grieving. For when angels fall, it is not justice that first awakens, it is mercy, and mercy must choose how far it will stretch. Samyaza stood beneath the same tree where he had buried her. Seasons had passed, the bark had darkened, roots had crept deeper, and yet the earth beneath it still breathed her name. He felt it in the soil. The scent of memory clung to the wind. He had given everything to love, and now he stood with nothing but silence. Above him the skies did not open, the veil did not lift. Even the stars seemed to have forgotten his name. The children he had fathered walked the earth with too much power and too little wisdom. Their feet cracked open stones. Their dreams shook the wind. Some carved monuments to their own glory. Others vanished into caves, speaking to shadows no one else could hear. Samyaza no longer tried to guide them. He watched as he had once watched from heaven, but this time with a broken heart. He often sat in the dust, hands stained by the soil, whispering prayers that rose into the night and dissolved before they reached the clouds. "Ya Rab," he would murmur, "even in silence I still remember you." But the silence only deepened. Azazel, meanwhile, had not forgotten heaven. He hated it, not the throne, not the creator, but the structure, the hierarchy, the waiting. The watching, the silence. We were made to bear light, he told the others, and yet we were left in darkness. He began teaching men how to break, not build. He whispered to kings the art of division, taught warriors how to carve fear into flesh, showed women how to seduce with herbs and charms that bled the line between spirit and skin. His knowledge was vast, his rage deeper. Others followed him, some out of belief, some out of despair. And so what began as longing turned into influence. The watchers were no longer just observers. They had become architects of a new kind of knowledge, one born outside the bounds of obedience, and the world changed. Weapons replaced words. Ambition replaced awe. The balance trembled. The Nephilim began to war with one another. Giants turned on giants. Some sought to rule men as gods. Others consumed the land like beasts unbound. Storms began to linger longer. Crops began to fail. The earth, once fertile, now sighed beneath too much weight. And still, the heavens did not respond, not with thunder, not with flame, but with something colder, stillness. Jibril returned to the Hall of Ashes. He did not bring news, he brought a pause, for now the silence had reached its fullness. The sorrow was complete, and in that stillness came a whisper, not in language, but in decree. The throne had spoken, not in fury, but in finality, and Jibril moved, not with haste, but with gravity. He crossed the realms like a wave that did not need wind. As he passed, stars veiled themselves. Winds bent low, even the trees stopped their breath. He did not speak to the watchers, he would speak to a man, a prophet. For when the world begins to forget the balance, God sends not armies but a single voice wrapped in flesh, trembling with truth. His name was Noah, chosen, not because he was mighty, but because he was still listening. Jibril came to him in the quiet, not with trumpets, not with visions that scorched the sky, but like a shadow of light in the corner of the soul. And Noah fell to his knees, heart gripped by something beyond understanding. He was told of rain, of rising water, of cleansing, not punishment, but mercy that has no other path. Noah wept, not for himself, but for the world. The message was clear. The Nephilim had become too large for the land. The watchers had rewritten the rhythm of the earth. And now it must return. The waters must rise, not to drown innocence, but to wash away what no longer belonged. He was commanded to build not a fortress, but a vessel, not a weapon, but a womb, a second beginning. As Noah gathered wood, the watchers watched him. Samyaza saw the hammer in his hand and understood. Azazel saw it and scoffed. They both knew what it meant. Heaven was no longer grieving. It was responding. The watchers met beneath Mount Hermon, where their vow had once been made. They stood not as brothers, but as exiles. Some wept, some argued, some pleaded for forgiveness. Samyaza looked to the sky, eyes dim with decades of sorrow. "We were made of light," he whispered, "and we loved with shadows." Azazel stepped forward, eyes burning. "If we fall again," he said, "then let us fall loudly." But the others did not move. They had once descended in desire. Now they stood in dread, for the wind had changed. The birds no longer flew in certain directions. The animals began to move two by two toward something unseen. The earth knew, and the watchers could not stop it. Samyaza turned to the others. "Pray," he said. Azazel laughed. "To whom?" The others did not answer, because even in their silence, they still remembered the sound of his name. The first drop did not fall with thunder. It slid from the sky like a tear, gentle, unnoticed. Noah felt it on his brow as he bent over the vessel, palms cracked from years of obedience. He looked up, eyes clouded with prayer. The sky stared back, dark and still. Then came the second drop, and the third. Each one a whisper from the divine, each one heavier than any word. Heaven was not weeping. Heaven was washing. The watchers saw the clouds gather, not like storm, but like memory, thick with all the grief the throne had borne in silence. Samyaza stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the horizon darken. He no longer spoke. His voice had grown hoarse from unanswered prayers. His children, the Nephilim, had begun to sense it too. They were not built for storms. Their eyes, once defiant, now flickered with confusion. Some ran, others roared, but nowhere was far enough. Nowhere high enough. Azazel watched them scatter. He turned his face to the clouds and smiled, not in joy but in defiance. "Let it come," he whispered, and it did. The rain fell, not with fury but with resolve. It did not stop. Hour after hour, day after day, the skies poured like vessels being emptied after too long sealed. The rivers swelled, the hills vanished, forests bowed, the world became water. Noah entered the ark. Behind him, beasts settled into silence. The door closed not by his hand but by an unseen force. Finality. Outside, the watchers stood like shadows. They did not run. They did not fight. They had already fallen. Now they would drown, but angels do not die like men. Their punishment would be deeper. Samyaza lifted his face to the rain and let it baptize him not into life but into remembrance. He did not weep. He had no tears left. His soul had emptied them into the soil years ago. He only whispered, "Ya Allah." If this is your answer, let it be complete. The water rose. Azazel stood upon a boulder, arms wide like a false god, wind tearing at what remained of his glory. "They feared us once," he called to the wind. "They built monuments to us." The water kissed his feet. "They made myths of our names." The tide reached his waist. And yet now his voice broke. "We are forgot." The storm swallowed his last word. Elsewhere, the remaining watchers scattered. Some tried to flee to mountaintops. Others sank willingly into the deep, but none escaped, because the flood was not sent to destroy only flesh. It came to erase memory, to unwrite what had never been meant to be. The Nephilim, too large, too loud, too proud, screamed into the rain, voices shaking valleys that no longer existed. One by one they vanished, and the earth sighed, not in relief, but in sorrow. In the heavens, Jibril stood at the edge of the hall of ashes, wings lowered. He did not speak. He simply listened. Or in the depths of the water, the watchers had not died. They had been chained, buried, bound beneath mountains of shadow in realms no human foot could reach, not to be destroyed, but to await something, justice, or perhaps mercy's final form. Samyaza was taken not by hand, not by flame, but by decree. The earth opened, the sea split, and he descended not as punishment, but as prophecy, for their story was not over, only sealed. Azazel too was bound, deeper than stone, darker than night. His knowledge would sleep with him, but his anger remained. The watchers were no longer angels, nor demons, they were fallen. And beneath the ground, beneath forgotten cities and ancient ruins, they wait not to return in glory, but to be remembered in whispers. Noah's ark floated on a world that had wept itself clean. Inside, silence. Outside, the memory of giants lingered in the mist. Above, the throne did not rejoice. Heaven does not celebrate loss, but it remembers, always, even what it must forget. And so the watchers remained somewhere between light and judgment, somewhere beneath the waters of the first sorrow. Somewhere still watching, the rain had stopped, the wind had quieted, and the earth did not move. It lay beneath the heavens like a child wrapped in soaked cloth, too exhausted to speak, too broken to cry. The mountains had forgotten their names. The trees had become strangers to their own roots. The birds no longer sang. Even the rivers whispered in hushed tones, afraid to wake the memory of the flood. Noah opened the door of the ark. The sky was pale, not with sunlight, but with mercy slowly returning to its place. And yet below the surface something remained. The watchers, once radiant, now buried in silence. The Nephilim vanished but not erased. And in the soil, in the very breath of the dust, echoes still stirred. For blood has a memory, and the earth remembers. Even after mercy has passed over it, even after the flood, even after silence, it remembers. When Noah stepped onto the new land, he did not speak. He kissed the ground and let his tears mix with the mud. His sons followed, eyes wide with reverence and dread. They had survived, but they were not the same. No one survives divine mercy untouched. The creatures stepped out slowly, hesitant. Even the lions no longer roared. The wolves did not howl. The doves refused to fly. Something sacred had been shattered. The covenant would come later. The rainbow, the promise. But in this moment there was only aftermath. And below, deep beneath stone and time, the watchers did not sleep. They could not. For even in chains, angels remember the light. Samyaza stirred beneath the veil of the deep, not in defiance. In ache, he did not dream, but he recalled her voice, her song, the laughter of his child. The first night he felt the rain, the first moment he understood loss. The flood had taken their bodies, but not their story, and the earth, now dry, began to breathe again. But that breath was shallow. For something had shifted forever. The line between the divine and the human had been pierced. The watchers had fallen. The Nephilim had ruled. The soil had drunk blood that should never have existed, and from that blood came seed, not of giants, but of men who remembered giants. The stories passed down from father to son, from elder to child, tales of mighty ones who spoke in thunder and moved like storms, myths of angels who had once walked like men and loved like gods. But stories, when repeated too long, lose their fear. They become curiosity, they become desire. And in the days after the flood, as the world tried to become clean again, men began to seek what had once broken them, not by building temples, but by chasing power. Some dug deep into the earth, not for crops, but for memory. Others studied the stars, not to worship, but to open old doors. They called out to names long buried: Azazel, Samyaza, Sariel. And in the quiet corners of the world, they whispered words that hadn't been spoken since the flood. Words of summoning, words of blood. The watchers could not answer, but something else listened. Shadows stirred, not angels, not giants, but fragments, remnants, spirits of the Nephilim caught between realms, without body, without breath, but still present. The ancients called them many names. In some tongues they were shades, in others demons, but in the truest sense they were orphans of the forbidden. Born from a love that broke heaven, buried by a flood that silenced their voices, and now remembered by men too curious to fear. The earth had been made clean, but men had not, and blood always finds a way back to itself. In a small valley far from where the ark had rested, a child began to speak in tongues he had never been taught. His mother wept. His father built an altar of stone. They believed him touched by the divine, but the boy only spoke of cities he had never seen, of beings with wings wrapped in shadow, of fire that whispered secrets to the bones. Noah heard of the boy, and he trembled. He walked 3 nights to reach the village. When he saw the child, he did not enter the home. He knelt in the dust and wept, not for the boy, but for the earth. It had begun again, not with a flood, but with memory. He turned to the sky, eyes hollow, and whispered, "Ya Allah, must it always begin in blood?" The wind did not answer. The trees did not move. But somewhere beneath the soil, far beneath the mountains, the watchers stirred, and the chains began to hum. Not break, not yet, but hum, with the sound of remembrance, with the ache of return, with the hunger of a world not yet done with its first sin. The boy's name was Idris, but they did not call him that at first. They called him the one who dreamed standing. For even while awake, his eyes would gaze beyond what could be seen. His lips moved without sound. His hands drew symbols in the dust, circles within circles, lines shaped like rivers splitting stone. The villagers began to fear him, not because he was wicked, but because he remembered too much. He spoke of lands that had drowned, names that had sunk. He whispered of watchers bound in caves beneath the earth, whose eyes still glowed like stars behind a veil of shadow. He was only 9, but when he spoke, men fell silent. Noah sat with him, not as a prophet, but as a grandfather. He asked no questions. He offered no correction, only this: "What do you see, child?" And Idris would answer, always the same: "I see what the blood remembers." The Nephilim were gone, bodies dissolved into flood and time. But their spirits, the ancients said, wandered not by will but by grief. They had no heaven, they had no grave. They were echoes of a mistake that could not die. And the children of men, fragile, forgetful, but ever hungry, began to chase those echoes, not with reverence, but with ambition. Noah warned them. He stood in the new cities beneath stone arches carved with suns and serpents and cried out, "Do not build upon the ruins of rebellion." But they did not listen. The soil had grown fertile again, but not clean. Men sowed crops in it, and dreams of immortality, dreams of speaking to the sky without needing permission, dreams of becoming gods as the Nephilim once seemed to be. And slowly, softly, the old hunger returned. Began with symbols etched in the night, marks that mirrored the watchers' names. Then chants passed from whisper to whisper, promising knowledge if only the right offering was made. Some offered herbs, some offered animals, a few offered more, and the ground remembered, because every drop of blood speaks. Even after centuries, the blood of the Nephilim cried out from where it had been spilled, and in the darkest corners of the earth where sunlight rarely touched, the chains of the watchers pulsed. They did not loosen. But they were no longer still. Samyaza stirred in his prison, eyes closed, heart slow, not from rage, from memory. He could feel it, the voices of men calling not to God but to the ones who had once fallen for their sake. He did not want to rise. He did not want to return, but their prayers burned. And what is prayer if not a door? Azazel too felt it, but unlike Samyaza, he welcomed it. He had never forgotten the taste of dominion. The way men's hearts bent like reeds in the wind, the way they wept at the sight of fire made from nothing. He whispered back, not in words, in desire, and that desire found vessels. A man named Cabal, tall, sharp-eyed, draped in dark cloth, began to gather followers. He claimed to speak to angels. He promised to teach the language of the first fire. Noah confronted him. "You are not hearing angels," he said. "You are remembering devils." Cabal only smiled. "The devils," he replied, "remember us." And that was the truth that terrified Noah. The watchers had not forgotten, and the spirits of their sons could still listen. Idris stood beside his grandfather that night and said, "They do not rise like mountains, they rise like mist." "What do you mean?" Noah asked. "They seep slowly, until no one remembers what it felt like to be clean." The next morning, the river near their village turned the color of rust. Some said it was iron, others knew better. It was memory. The earth, once washed by flood, had begun to bleed again. Men built altars. They danced around stones carved in the likeness of things never meant to be shaped, and still they called it worship. Noah wept in solitude. He saw the same signs, the same arrogance, the same hunger. He saw that the blood had never stopped speaking, it had simply grown quiet until someone dared to listen. And now they were listening again. The watchers did not rise, but the world began to lean toward them. Like a tree growing toward the light of a fire, unaware it is stepping closer to its own burning. Idris, now 12, walked to the hill near the place where the flood's edge had once rested. He stood there until nightfall. When his grandfather found him, he did not turn. He simply said, "They are coming back." Noah's voice cracked. "Who?" "The ones who never left." And below, deep beneath the bones of forgotten cities, Samyaza opened his eyes, not because he wished to return, but because his name had been spoken, and names are doors too. Samyaza had not spoken in an age. There was no sky to see from where he was bound, no winds, no stars, no voice of God, only stone above and stillness within. He did not sleep. Angels do not need rest. But he had buried his thoughts deep beneath layers of silence, hopping, praying that memory itself might erode with time. But now names were rising, not from heaven, from earth, and that was more dangerous. Because heaven speaks in commands, but earth whispers in desire. On the surface, the people did not know they were calling him. They danced around fires and chanted syllables older than their ancestors' bones. They burned roots. They buried blood in clay jars. They stared into water and asked for dreams. And in those moments, something stirred in the space between the living and the bound. Samyaza heard them, faint, fumbling, full of yearning. He did not want to answer, but the chains responded for him. They glowed. Each link forged by the hand of angels, not iron but divine will. But will falters when memory returns. And the prayers, though ignorant, found their way through cracks in the world. Elsewhere, Azazel welcomed the sound. He reveled in it. In his prison of molten shadow, he smiled, not with joy, with triumph. He had waited, not idly, not with grief, but with patience sharpened into vengeance. He had no mercy left. He wanted return, not to teach, not to love, to rule. To become the God men already imagined him to be. And the world, unaware, leaned closer. In the cities of men, signs multiplied. The stars moved in strange ways. Rivers turned bitter. Trees bore fruit with no seeds. Children dreamed of towers reaching the sky. And Idris, now nearing manhood, wrote in the dust with trembling fingers, "They are coming." Noah sat with him again, older now, wearier. "They cannot rise," the prophet whispered. "God bound them." Idris did not look up. "We are unbinding them." The people had begun to hunger again, but this time they did not seek angels. They sought the power of angels without obedience, without surrender. They did not want heaven, they wanted control. And so they dug deeper. They wrote symbols on skin. They spilled animal blood beneath the roots of sacred trees. They burned incense that smelled like burning sky. They thought it was tradition, but it was invitation, and invitations are never left unanswered. One night a great light rose in the east, not from the stars, from the earth. It split the sky for only a moment, a whisper of fire that bent the horizon. No thunder followed, no quake, just a hush like the whole world holding its breath. Noah awoke in the dark. He did not speak, he knew. The watchers had not risen, but the veil between memory and matter had thinned. He walked to the river, the same place he had offered his first sacrifice after the flood. The water had turned black, not thick, not poison, just black like the absence of light. He touched it. It was cold, he wept, because he understood the second fall would not come from above, it would rise from beneath. Samyaza felt the shift. It was not freedom. The chains held, but they no longer felt firm. His limbs trembled with the weight of 1,000 years, not from strength returning, from sorrow waking. He remembered her again, her voice, her final breath, and his son, tall as trees, eyes like fire, now dust. He did not want the world to know him again, but the world was remembering, and memory brings resurrection. The Nephilim had been destroyed, but their spirits, half-formed, half-cursed, wandered still. And now men sought them, not to worship, to use. They wanted the strength of giants, the wisdom of angels, but without the obedience of servants. And so what had once been a sacred fall, tragic, wept over by heaven itself, was now becoming a commodity. The watchers' names were being carved into amulets, their symbols painted in red across temple stones. Even the flood, that holy erasure, was spoken of now as myth, and myth invites curiosity. Noah stood before the people once more, tired, fractured, firm. "You are unmaking the mercy that saved you." But they laughed. "We are only remembering." And that was the truth. They were remembering, but not with reverence, with hunger. And the earth, hearing its children call to the ones it had buried, shuddered. In the depths, chains sang, not in rebellion, in grief, because even punishment cannot last forever. Even judgment waits for repentance. But there was no repentance here, only pride. And so the world began to prepare itself not for flood, but for fire. For what had once fallen in love would now return in wrath. And still the sky remained silent, for heaven had already spoken. Now it was the earth's turn to answer. The blood had dried, but it had not disappeared. It lived in the veins of men who did not know where their strength came from, in their shoulders, in their stare, in their strange dreams that carried thunder when they slept. They were not giants in size, but something in them was displaced. They were born from clean wombs and quiet homes. But as they grew, the land grew nervous around them. Fire flickered when they passed. Stones seemed to remember them. Animals, once tamed, shied from their presence. They were sons of men, but the blood inside them was older, and it remembered. The giants had perished in the flood, but their spirit, their imprint, had not. It was carried like a bruise in the seed of humanity, not seen at first, not feared, until they reached the age when dreams turned to visions and visions turned to voices. They did not ask for this, but it came. One such boy named Canir stood at the edge of the southern sands. His arms bore no tattoos, his body was thin, but he walked like someone who had returned from war, though he had never seen a blade. At night he did not sleep, he listened, and the wind spoke back. At first he told his mother of these dreams, of a voice that echoed through caverns he could not name, of a golden figure with no face, of fire that called him brother. His mother wept. She knew the stories. Her grandmother had warned her, never marry a man from the bloodline of the old ones, but love does not listen. And now the curse had found her son. Canir's eyes darkened with every passing moon. He walked further from the village. He carved signs into stone with his fingers, not knives, fingers, and the signs glowed when the moon was hidden. He did not worship the watchers. He became one, not in form, in awareness. In another land, far beyond the sea, a woman gave birth to twin daughters. The midwife screamed when she saw their eyes black as obsidian but shining like water. They did not cry when born, they hummed. Their father left the village that night and never returned. The people did not speak of the twins. They were fed in silence, taught in whispers, and when they sang, the sky clouded over. The old women of the village said nothing, but behind locked doors they sharpened knives with trembling hands. Because even now the Watcher's legacy haunted the womb, not through will, through residue. The giants had left more than bones behind. They had left memory in the blood. Noah saw it. He saw the children rising with gifts they did not understand, strength beyond what the body should hold, voices that could calm storms, eyes that glowed in the dark. He saw it in his own line, and it broke him. One of his grandsons had begun to speak to stones, claiming the rocks answered back. Another had dreams of flight, not with wings, but with thought. Noah took no joy in these things. He fasted more, prayed longer, but the world did not wait for prayers. It marched toward remembrance, and in the earth Samyaza wept, not because he was rising, but because he was being repeated. He had fallen once for love, but now his memory was birthing ambition. And that he feared more than the flood. He remembered the pain of disobedience, but the world now remembered only the power. Azazel did not weep, he laughed. He watched from his prison, delighted. The sons of men were calling upon forces they did not understand, begging for strength, invoking rituals that had once torn heaven in half. They have become like us, he murmured, and perhaps worse, because men do not fall from heaven. They climb toward it with bloodied hands. In the east a kingdom rose, not with worship, with fear. Its ruler claimed he was the descendant of the giants. He walked with a limp, but his voice could split the air. He surrounded himself with mirrors and obsidian. His servants carried staffs with symbols no scribe could translate. He demanded sacrifices, not of wealth, of blood. He said the Watchers had promised him dominion if he fed them memory. And memory, he said, lived strongest in pain. The altars grew taller, and the sky turned quiet again, not the silence of mercy, the silence before fire. Idris traveled across the new lands barefoot, head bowed. He said nothing, but the ground whispered beneath his steps. In one village he knelt beside a well and wept, not for death, for birth. The return was not coming from above. It was being born again through the veins of men who never asked to be carriers. He touched a child's hand and saw flame behind her eyes. He whispered, "You must not sing." But the girl only smiled. "The wind already taught me how." Noah built a tower of wood and knelt upon it every dusk. He did not speak to angels. He spoke to silence, not to ask for answers, to offer his sorrow, because he understood now the Watchers had fallen once. But men fall again and again, not from exile but from pride. And pride wears no chains. It rises quietly in the blood. And so giants returned, not with height, with hunger, not in form, in legacy. The world that had been washed was now bleeding again, but this time not from the heavens, from within. The fire no longer needed wood to burn. It lived now in breath, in glance, in silence passed between those born of sacred echoes. Children who never learned to speak the old tongues were somehow reciting prayers from before the flood. Men whose ancestors had long forgotten, the Watchers began to build altars that mimicked ancient stones swallowed by oceans. It was not the giants who returned. It was the idea of them. And ideas are harder to bury than bodies. Canir no longer spoke to his mother. He wandered into the ruins of an old city where the stones still bore scorch marks from the first wrath. He traced the walls with his fingertips. They responded with warmth. Beneath the surface he could feel the presence of something waiting, not alive, not dead, but alert. And then it happened. He placed his hand on a broken pillar and whispered, "Do you remember me?" And the earth pulsed, not with words, but with recognition, as though a forgotten door inside the stone had opened, and it did not ask questions. It welcomed. That night Canir dreamed of chains, not his own, others. He saw a great chasm, deep and hollow, where light was strangled by darkness. He He heard voices, hundreds of them calling not to be freed but to be heard. And at the center of that darkness he saw a figure, eyes closed, face veiled, bound by silence older than time. It was not Samyaza he saw, but Samyaza's sorrow. And when he woke, his voice was different. He could sing now in tones that bent the air. Elsewhere in the shadowed valleys beyond the Euphrates, a tribe carved strange markings into the trees. They had never heard of the Watchers, they had no stories of angels, and yet their dreams told them to build. They shaped their idols with wings, not bird wings, not creature wings, wings made of light and fire, and they prayed to beings who had never spoken to them. Still, something listened. A drought fell upon their land, not sent as punishment, but summoned by imbalance. The skies did not open, because the skies had already spoken once, and this was no longer a matter for rain. It was a matter of blood. In the cities, the children of men no longer feared the old stories. They taught them as legend, as myth, as metaphor. They mocked the idea of watchers falling for love. They rewrote the tale into power plays and forbidden desire. They took the names Samyaza, Azazel, Arakel, and turned them into symbols of rebellion. And rebellion became fashionable. They did not understand what they were doing. They were not wicked. They were ignorant, but ignorance is the sharpest tool of the fallen, because it opens doors without knowing there are locks. Idris, now grown, walked the land like a man burdened by sky. His eyes always faced downward, not in shame, in reverence. He had seen too much, and still he remained pure. The spirits of the Nephilim passed near him but did not touch. The echoes of the Watchers stirred at his presence but could not speak. There was something in him they could not claim, a stillness older than the fall. He built no temples, he offered no sacrifices, he simply listened. And because he listened, the earth told him what others ignored, that the giants had returned not in stature but in intent. They did not need height to break the world, only hunger, and that hunger now wore human skin. In one village, a man lifted a stone no two men could carry. He said he heard the voice of his father telling him to do it. But his father had died the winter before. Another child grew to be 10 feet tall before his 12th year. He spoke only at night and only in riddles. Another woman bore a child with eyes that shone gold when he cried. The midwife said nothing. She only left and never came back. The people began to gather such children. They built homes for them far from the rivers. They taught them not to speak, not to look at the moon, not to pray in the open. But every full moon the children sang. They did not know the words, but the world did, and the Watchers stirred. Samyaza heard the song. It was faint, like wind brushing ash, but he heard it. And for the first time since the flood, he opened his eyes without sorrow, not because he rejoiced, because he feared. They were calling him again, not with voice, with blood. And blood is the one language no angel can ignore. He tried to close his heart, but hearts made of light do not close easily. They remember every cry, every vow, every kiss. He remembered the woman. Her name had faded, but her scent remained like the memory of rain in dry stone. He did not want to return, but the earth was choosing for him, and Azazel was already preparing. The chains did not break, but they breathed, and that was enough to shift the world once more. Noah awoke in the middle of the night, breath caught, heart pounding. He had dreamed of towers, not built of stone, built of pride, men reaching again toward the heavens, but not to worship, to take. And above them the stars wept, because they had seen this story before. The night was still, but the earth was not. In the lowlands where the shadows pooled thickest, children began waking from sleep, not with screams but with songs, low, humming, ancient. Their voices moved like smoke. Their eyes were open, glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting no light. Their mothers trembled. Fathers hid their fear behind silence. Some tried to hush the songs, but they were not meant to be silenced. They were not lullabies, they were remembrances, not of childhood, of blood. Idris stood on a hill overlooking 3 villages. Smoke curled in soft spirals from the chimneys. From this distance it all looked peaceful, but peace is not always the absence of war. Sometimes it is the silence before a memory awakens. He closed his eyes and pressed his palms to the ground. It was warm, almost fevered. Like the earth itself was trying to sweat out a sickness it could not name. He whispered a verse, not to control, not to bind, but to remind. O soil that once held the mercy of the flood, do not forget your sorrow. A breeze passed, and for a moment the ground cooled, but only for a moment. Elsewhere, a group of men gathered in an underground chamber. Their torches burned blue, not from magic but from oils harvested under an eclipsed moon. They wore robes embroidered with names they did not understand. They chanted in unison. Their language was broken, but their intent clear. They wanted power, not for justice, for dominion. A scroll lay open before them. It bore the sigils of the old watchers, not written by angels, but by men who had dreamed too deeply. One of them, trembling, read aloud the invocation. It was not a summons. It was a key. And somewhere in the deep earth something shifted, not entirely, just a breath, just a twitch. But even the smallest gesture, when born of ancient power, sends cracks through creation. Azazel felt it first. He laughed, not like a man, like thunder behind a veil. The sons of men still believe they can command what they do not understand, he said. He rolled his shoulders and the stones around him groaned. His prison held, but it strained. He could almost taste the air above again. Not yet, but soon. He knew they would not stop. They would keep digging, keep calling, because that is the nature of man when he forgets the fire that once burned him. Samyaza remained still. He heard the chanting. He felt the pull, but he did not rejoice. He mourned. Every time the watchers are remembered, something sacred dims. He remembered the day he first saw her, the woman by the river, her laughter like water brushing stones. He had not fallen in lust. He had fallen in wonder. And now that wonder had been twisted into invocation. His name, once whispered in awe, was now chanted in greed. That was the real fall, not when he left heaven, when men stopped seeing the divine as something to surrender to and instead something to wield. In the city that bore no name, a boy named Haran walked through the market, his shadow longer than it should be. He did not notice, but the vendors did. Their breath quickened when he passed, not from fear, from recognition. Though they had never seen him before, he spoke to a tree once, a dead one, and it bloomed. Another time he stepped into a flooded canal. The water stilled around him. As if unsure whether to part or rise, the elders debated. He is blessed, one said. He is cursed, whispered another. They were both wrong. He was a return, not of body, of pattern. And patterns are prophecies in disguise. Noah watched from afar. His hair had gone white. His hands, once strong enough to carve ark wood, now shook when he lifted them to the sky. He saw what was happening. He saw how the world had turned from the memory of the flood, not in fear but in forgetfulness. And that he feared most. He called upon God, not with words of protest, with confession. We are the children of mercy, and still we ask for fire. He fell to his knees and wept into the soil. The ground beneath him whispered. It said nothing, but it listened. In a valley where no birds flew, where the grass grew in strange spirals and the stones were warm even at night, something began to rise. Not a creature, not a god, a memory. A memory so strong it shaped the air, thickened the silence, and pulled dreams into alignment. Men began to gather there. They did not know why. Their feet brought them. Their blood called them. They built a temple of bones, not human, something older, something taller. They lit no fires. The stones glowed on their own. And in the center they carved a name, not Samyaza, not Azazel. A name lost even to the watchers, but known to the blood. Idris arrived 3 days later. He stood at the edge of the valley. He did not enter. He did not speak. He simply opened his palm to the wind, and a single black feather landed there. It burned not with heat but with memory, and he knew the watchers were not rising. The world was bending to make room for their return, not with shouts, with invitation, and the blood had already opened the door. It started with a whisper, not from heaven, from man. We can reach him, they said, not in prayer, in height. They were not prophets. They were not priests. They were architects of ambition, sons of survivors who forgot the sound of the flood and remembered only its silence. They gathered stone and fire brick. They crushed clay with bare feet and built kilns that glowed red against the dusk. They did not raise altars, they raised walls, higher than trees, wider than rivers, measured not by need but by pride. And in their hearts a single question bloomed like smoke: why should heaven remain above us? The tower had no name in the beginning, only longing. Its base was surrounded by chants, songs of unity, songs of purpose. Men and women from distant lands speaking different tongues came together with shared desire to ascend, not in spirit, in structure. They said it was for God, but what they meant was so that he might see us. Noah heard of the city from travelers, a place where the skis burned at night and the ground never cooled, where men claimed they would build into the stars. He knew what it meant. He had seen this story before, only this time it would not be angels descending, it would be men climbing. With blood still wet on their hands, Idris stood on a distant ridge, his cloak heavy with sand. He did not blink. Even from leagues away he could feel it. The weight of stones lifted not with reverence but resentment. The watchers had fallen once for love. Now men sought to rise from pride. He stepped forward and whispered, "This tower is not reaching toward heaven. It is dragging heaven down." The builders worked day and night. They did not sleep. They sang as they toiled. Not holy hymns, but verses carved in rebellion. Some of them bore strange markings on their forearms, ancient symbols passed down in secret, said to have belonged to the watchers themselves. They claimed these gave them power, gave the bricks strength. One of the chief builders, a man named Nimru, walked barefoot over molten stone. He said the tower had chosen him, that he saw visions when the wind blew from the north, that fire bowed to him. He taught his workers to chant the names of the stars while stacking stones. He said, "This tower will be our judgment of heaven, our trial of God." No one dared oppose him, because when he walked, the shadows bent in his direction. In the depths of the tower, beneath its lowest stone, they buried offerings, not fruit, not grain, blood, animals at first. Then children born with strange eyes. Nimru said the watchers would see their devotion, that the giants would return through the work of their hands. And the people believed him because power is a strong preacher. Samyaza heard the chants. His chains pulsed. He wanted to close his ears, but how does one close themselves from the cry of their own legacy? He had fallen once, thinking love could survive outside obedience. Now men twisted that fall into permission. He whispered into the silence around him, "Yarab, let me not rise if it means they will fall again." But heaven did not answer. Heaven had already answered with silence. Now it was the earth's turn to speak, and it was speaking in stone. Azazel, buried deeper, laughed, not because he rejoiced in the tower, because he remembered. He had whispered similar dreams into the hearts of the watchers long ago. Teach them, give them, elevate them. Now men were teaching themselves, giving to themselves, elevating themselves. They no longer needed angels to fall. They were falling upward. The tower rose past the treetops, past the hills, past the clouds. It pierced the horizon like a blade made of pride. And for the first time since the flood, the sky stirred, not with wind, not with wrath, with grief, because men had remembered what should have been forgotten, and forgotten what should have been remembered. One night Idris entered the city. No one saw him. The air trembled around him, not from heat, from warning. He walked to the edge of the tower, placed his hand upon the stone, and wept. "Every brick laid here," he whispered, "was pulled from the bones of memory." He pressed his ear to the wall. Inside, he heard laughter, not human, not divine, something else. Something waiting. He stepped back and spoke only once. "This tower is not touching heaven, it is awakening what sleeps beneath it." The morning after, the skis turned a color no one had a name for. Birds flew in reverse. Children cried without sound. And the tower cast no shadow. It was no longer growing in height. It was growing in weight. And heaven was beginning to lean. The air grew thick around the tower, not with smoke, not with mist, but with memory. As if the sky itself could no longer bear to look directly upon it. And still they built. Higher, heavier, deeper into the heaven they could not see. They sang songs in unison, not of praise but of defiance. Not you are God, but so are we. And with each stone lifted, something else descended, not from the sky, but from beneath, not angels, not watchers, but something unshaped. In the tunnels beneath the tower, they had carved passages no one dared map, a labyrinth of secrets and symbols. Fires burned day and night, fueled not by oil, but by something they would not name. Here they whispered the names of the watchers with reverence and hunger. Azazel, Samiaza, Barakiel, each name chanted as a key hopping to unlock not light but power. One chamber was colder than the rest. Its walls bore the same sigils found etched into ruins from before the flood, symbols that had survived when nothing else did. And in its center a pool, dark, still. They believed it was just water. But water does not pulse, and this did. When the priests entered, they knelt. They said they felt their hearts beat faster. Their dreams grew louder, that the pool spoke not in language but in feeling. It told them, keep building. Above, Nimru stood atop the highest platform. His eyes burned with purpose. His skin shimmered faintly in the sun like ash wrapped in light. He looked to the horizon and whispered, do you see us now? He meant God, but the sky gave no answer. Instead, the wind changed. Not direction, tone. It no longer whispered across the stones, it hissed. In the outer city, children stopped speaking. Their tongues moved, but no sound came. Parents panicked, priests rejoiced. They are being purified, they said, the first sign of the Watcher's return. But Idris, standing at the border, knew better. They are not being purified, he whispered. They are being erased. For the Watchers, even in their silence, carried weight too vast for mortal minds. Their grief alone could shatter thought. And now men were calling them, not with repentance but with demand. They were asking for the fall to happen again, but this time from the other direction. Inside the tower, a woman named Leah stood alone in one of the upper chambers. She had not spoken in days, not because she could not, because she knew. Her body was tired, her soul full. She had seen visions of wings dipped in rust, of thrones buried beneath sand, of eyes without lids watching from beneath stone. She wrote what she saw on the walls. No ink, only fingertips. The stone accepted it, glowed, then dimmed again. She knew she was not a prophet, she was a mirror, and what she reflected now was not heaven, it was the ache of those still bound beneath it. Far away in a cave that had long been silent, Samiaza stirred again, not from desire, from pain. The voices were too loud now, too many calling, not to him but through him. They were not trying to raise the Watchers, they were trying to become them, and that was more dangerous than any fall. He clenched his fists. The chains hummed. He whispered, Ya Allah, let me fall again if it means they do not rise in our place. Azazel grinned. He could feel the tower's foundation, how it trembled with every chant, how it fed on every forgotten vow. He had always said the Watchers should rule. Now the children of men would become his proof. He stretched and stone cracked. Only a hairline fracture, but the earth noticed. Noah, old and weathered, stood outside his home, hands raised. He had not spoken in weeks. He no longer asked for mercy, he only waited. And one night the stars shifted, not in pattern, in color. A soft amber hue bled into the night sky, a color not seen since before the flood. The animals grew restless. The birds stopped singing. And in the heart of the city, the tower cast a shadow that moved without the sun. It began reaching backward, as if trying to gather what it had forgotten. Nimru stood beneath the highest arch. He lifted his arms and cried, We have touched the foot of heaven. The people roared. They did not see the clouds above them swirling not around but down, not as rain, as memory. They had built high enough now that the past could see them. Idris entered the city at dawn. No one stopped him. He walked to the tower, placed his hand on its side and whispered, You are not a bridge, you are a wound. And the tower listened. It did not fall, not yet. But it leaned just slightly, just enough for the sky to take notice, just enough for heaven to murmur, not again. It happened in silence, no thunder, no lightning, just breath. A long cosmic breath that swept across the tower like a sigh from the unseen places above the stars. It did not break stone, it did not shatter mortar, it simply spoke, not in words, in undoing. The people gathered at the base, looking up at what they had built, proud, full, certain. Mothers lifted children to see the peak. Men wept, not from awe but accomplishment. "We are here," they whispered, but they were nowhere. For heaven is not a place one arrives by climbing. It is a silence one is invited into, and this tower, this stairway of pride, had never been invited. Then it began. The voices, once united, broke. The chants twisted in the mouths of the builders. Where once they sang in one tongue, now they spoke in many. Not by choice, by decree. One man shouted for bricks. Another handed him water. A woman wept beside a man she had known since birth. He no longer understood her name. The harmony shattered. Confusion bloomed like thorns in every mouth. Not chaos, not punishment, separation. Idris stood at the base of the tower, his eyes filled with tears, not from joy but sorrow. "They were warned," he whispered. "Even before they began, they were warned." He looked upward. The sky was still. But there was weight in it, like the air before the first drop of rain, the breath before the first cry of a newborn. It wasn't wrath he felt, it was grief. And grief was always quieter than anger. In the lowest chamber the pool turned red, not with blood, with memory. It pulsed once, then stilled. The men inside screamed. They spoke to one another in words they had used for years but now sounded like ash and wind. One tried to flee. He could not find the exit. Because even the stone no longer remembered its maker. Azazel howled with laughter. "Now they see," he roared. "They wanted our names, now they cannot even remember their own." His chains burned with delight. He pressed against them and they held, but they trembled, because even chains, when shaken long enough by prayer and pride, begin to question their own design. Samyaza did not laugh. He closed his eyes. He remembered the first time he heard the language of man, soft, simple, sacred. And now it had splintered, not into curses, into questions. "Who am I? What did I say? What have we done?" He whispered into the earth, hoping God still heard. "Do not break them as you broke us. They are made of flesh. We were made of fire. Let your mercy fall heavier than your silence." The tower stood. It did not fall, but it stopped, not from weakness, from a divine pause, and that pause became legend. The city emptied slowly, not from fear, from frustration. No one could speak to their neighbor. No one could trade. No one could build. The unity that once drove stone into sky had dissolved into confusion, and so they left. Some wandered north, others east. Some sailed, others followed stars they could no longer name. They left the tower behind not as a ruin, as a warning. Generations would pass, languages would be born, borders would be drawn, but all of it would trace back to this, a tower built not to honor the heavens but to reach past them. In the deep, the watchers grew still again. The voices had stopped calling. The chants no longer echoed. Their names no longer held meaning on the tongues of men, and perhaps that was mercy. For to be forgotten is sometimes safer than to be remembered wrongly. Idris wandered. He no longer tried to stop what was coming. He only tried to remind those who still had ears. We were made to kneel, not because we are low, but because he is high. They listened sometimes, but the ground beneath them had begun to stir again. And Idris knew the tower was not the end. It was only the reminder. That man forgets, that pride returns, and that mercy is often mistaken for absence until it rains again. Far from the tower, in a quiet cave, a feather fell from the ceiling, black, silent, soft as ash. It landed on a stone marked with no name. The stone breathed only once, and the earth listened. There are places the sun has never touched, caverns beneath caverns, roots wrapped around bone, echoes so old they no longer resemble sound. And in those places, beneath the feet of men who walk without knowing what lies below, the watchers whisper, not in words, in weight. Beneath the mountains that once kissed the sky before the flood swallowed their pride, there lies a hollow heart, a chamber carved not by time but by sorrow. Its walls breathe, not with wind, with memory. This is where they were buried, not with shovels, with decree. The watchers, not all, not most, but the ones whose fall cracked the firmament. Azazel was cast deep, his prison scorched with the flame of divine jealousy. Samyaza was buried gently as a broken oath can be buried. Others were forgotten entirely. Their names never passed through human lips again. But the mountains remember. Stone never forgets a cry. One such place was called Dur al-Ghafilin, the fortress of the unaware. Men avoided it without knowing why. Birds refused to fly near it. Even the stars, when passing overhead, seemed to dim just slightly, as if offering condolence to something they did not dare awaken. It was there that a traveler arrived, cloaked in dusk and silence. He said no name, carried no staff, left no footprints, but the mountain knew him and opened. Inside, the air was colder than death, not cruel, reverent, like standing in the silence of a forgotten prayer. He walked slowly, not from fear, from respect. Around him, carvings, not etched, burned. As though the stone had once wept fire. Symbols spiraled into the dark, circles wrapped around eyes, wings enclosed in chains, hands raised not in worship, in surrender, and beneath each carving a name, not spoken but felt. They pulsed faintly beneath the fingertips, as if the mountain itself still breathed with the ache of what had been imprisoned here. The traveler came to a great hall, circular, endless. Its center bore a stone basin, dry and cracked, though no water had ever filled it. He knelt beside it, and for the first time in generations he spoke, Samyaza. The name fell like dust onto silence. Nothing answered, but the walls tightened, and a voice, ancient, fragile, worn thin by centuries of silence, whispered back, "You remember me." Samyaza's spirit had not faded, it had withdrawn. He had listened to the voices of men grow distant. He had heard their tongues twist, their stories bend, their prayers reshape his name into something he no longer recognized. He had begged God for one mercy, let me be forgotten. But here in the belly of the mountain someone had remembered, and remembrance opens doors. Why have you come? The voice asked, not as a threat but as a weary sigh. The traveler bowed his head. To warn you. Of what? Of echoes returning. Samyaza did not reply. He did not need to. He had felt them, in the weight of dreams, in the silence between stars, in the sudden chill that ran through the stone. The watchers were not rising, but something worse was. Imitation. Men were no longer waiting for the divine. They were becoming their own gods, and gods made of flesh rot from the inside out. I cannot help them, Samyaza said. I already fell. You can still speak. What would I say? Truth. Elsewhere, beneath a different mountain, something stirred, not in sorrow, in laughter. Azazel, long bound in fire and shadow, felt the same tremors, but he did not mourn them, he welcomed them. Build again, he whispered. Good. His chains were tighter than Samyaza's, but his will sharper. He pressed against the walls of his prison with thought alone, and the stone flinched. Above, the mountain cracked. A thin line, barely visible, but it bled light, not warm, white, severe, the kind of light that reveals too much, and then hides again. The traveler in Dur al-Ghafilin rose to his feet. I will carry your words, he said. Samyaza did not answer, but the carvings on the wall began to hum. Low, melancholy, as if they too had waited too long to be heard. He stepped away from the basin, never turning his back, because reverence remains, even for the fallen. Outside, the wind howled softly, but the trees nearby did not move. They were listening, not to the wind, to what had just awakened. And deep beneath, in the places where giants once wept and angels once knelt, a new whisper began to travel, not of war, not of wrath, of return. The traveler descended the mountain in silence. Each step was slow, not from fatigue, but from knowing he had just spoken with a sorrow that did not belong to this world. His cloak gathered dust, yet he seemed untouched. The air around him moved differently now. Animals watched him from the trees but did not flee. Even the stones beneath his sandals seemed to soften. He carried no scroll, no command, only a name and a whisper. Samyaza had not given prophecy, he had given grief. And grief, when passed from angel to man, does not echo, it embeds. In a village near the base of the mountain, a woman dreamt of wings wrapped in chains. She awoke gasping, her hands covered in ash though no fire had burned. Her newborn cried out in the night, not in fear but in song. The melody carried through the valley like wind against a harp with no strings. The elders gathered the next morning. The watchers are stirring, one said. "They never stopped," answered another. "They marked their doors with old symbols drawn from memory no one claimed to have. And still the dreams came. Far from there, a temple of stone stood hidden in the gorge called Alcuda, the lines. No map remembered it, but the earth did. Priests with no names and eyes like storm clouds gathered there each moonless night. They carried books wrapped in skin, inked with languages that had no vowels, only breath. Their chants were not songs, they were summons, and not to God, to the bound. They did not seek wisdom, they sought reversal, to undo what the flood had erased, to call forth what the fire had buried, not the watchers themselves, but their principle. Knowledge without permission, power without obedience, glory without God. In a dream, Azazel laughed. He saw the temple, the torches, the offerings. He saw the blood spilled in bowls carved from mountain bone. And he felt the wall behind his back warm. He pressed against it not with force but with permission. And it cracked, hairline. Subtle enough to make the shadows move. In Duer al-Gafalin the basin began to fill, not with water, with light, not gold, not fire, not warmth, a pale glow like the memory of a flame that no longer burns but refuses to go dark. Samyaza whispered, "They are calling him." And the mountain answered, "I know." Idris, far from both mountains, woke in the night. His chest ached, not from illness, from prophecy. He rose, lit no lamp, and began to walk. He had known since birth that this would come, the return of what was never meant to return. He passed fields in silence. Trees bowed slightly as he moved. He did not run, because destiny, when it approaches, must be met at a walking pace. At the temple of Alcuda, the priests chanted a final phrase older than scripture, older than soil. And then stillness. The pool at the center began to churn. Slow at first, then violent, it spun without wind, it hissed without flame. The torches blew out though no breeze came, and from the pool a hand emerged, not flesh, not spirit, something between. Its fingers were wrapped in shadow, its nails shone like shattered glass, its movements were slow, not hesitant, calculated, and then it spoke, not aloud, into the minds of every man present. "You remembered me." One priest collapsed. Another ran, screaming into the gorge, never to return. The rest knelt. Azazel had not risen, but his mouth had. The temple now held a piece of his presence, not enough to destroy, enough to deceive. The traveler reached the edge of the riverbed by dawn. The light was gray, filtered through clouds heavy with more than rain. He met Idris there, no words, only a nod. The river between them stilled, and Idris said, "You saw him." The traveler nodded again. "Will he rise?" Idris looked to the clouds. "No," he said, "but he will speak." And the others? Some will remember, most will follow, few will know the difference. Samyaza, deep in the mountain, turned his gaze upward. He could not move, but his grief moved through stone, through root, through dream. And he spoke, "Forgive them, not for what they do, but for what they become." And the mountain wept, not in flood, in dust. A single breath of gray ash drifted from its peak, and across the valley children stopped playing for a moment, not from fear, from awareness. Something beneath the world had just remembered itself, and that memory had a name. The wind that morning carried no scent, no flowers, no soil, no rain, only silence stretched thin across the land like a cloth pulled too tight. The trees stood still, the birds did not rise, and the animals, even the wolves, stayed hidden beneath root and rock. For the mountains were breathing again, and something in the deep had begun to stir, not in rebellion, not in rage, but in recognition. In a village not far from Duer al-Gafalin, a young boy named Luhain sat beside a stream, humming to himself. His eyes were soft, his hair caught the sun like honey, but the song he sang was not taught to him. His mother asked, "Where did you learn that melody?" He looked up, blinked slowly, and said, "I didn't learn it, I remembered it." She froze, because the tune was the same her grandmother had once forbidden in hushed warning, the song of the buried ones, the watchers. Luhain began drawing circles in the dirt, 7 rings, interwoven, a single line through the center descending, not rising. The other children laughed, but the soil beneath him pulsed warm, and far beneath in the hollows of the mountain something heard, not because it was called, because it had always been listening. In a hidden chamber of Al-Qudat, the priests met again. Their voices had returned to them, but not as before. Now when they spoke, their words carried weight. Doors opened. Candles lit without flame, and in their dreams they walked on ceilings made of smoke. One priest stood at the edge of the chasm and whispered, "He will come fully soon." Another answered, "He already is." They had no leader now, only the voice. It spoke to all of them, not with command but suggestion. And suggestion is more powerful than law because it lets the heart think the decision is its own. Azazel was not free, but freedom was no longer the goal. Influence was. And influence had been loosed like wind in dry grass. A child in the north had begun speaking languages her parents could not name. A farmer in the south awoke each morning with symbols burned into his forearms, though he swore no fire had touched him. A wellspring in the east had begun to hum, and those who drank from it felt braver and colder. None of these were miracles. They were fractures, hairline cracks in the seal of heaven's silence. Idris knew. He saw them not with eyes, but with the sight granted to those who listen. He walked with the traveler through the hills, now bare of birdsong. "They are not rising," the traveler said. "They are spreading," Idris replied. The grief of the watchers, the rage of Azazel, the echoes of the Nephilim, none needed bodies to return. They had become breath, and breath passes easily between soul and soul. Samyaza watched from his place of binding. He had asked once for release. Now he prayed to remain forgotten. But forgetting is a mercy man rarely grants. He could feel his sorrow rising not like fire but like mist. It was being shared now. He wept. Not because the watchers would return, because their wound would. And wounds that are not healed become legacies. In a quiet cave, an old woman sang to a child. The lullaby was soft, sweet, and full of light. But halfway through the song, her voice broke, because the child's eyes had begun to glow. And the melody she hummed was no longer her own. The priests began writing, not scripture, instructions, blueprints for altars that could hold shadow, for vessels that could echo with lost names, for bridges between spirit and clay. They called it reunion. But it was not a return of the watchers, it was a mirroring. Men making themselves in the image of those who fell, but without the love that once softened the fall, only hunger. In the west, a mountain trembled. A shepherd ran screaming into the valley, saying the stones had spoken, that the earth beneath his feet had whispered a name he had never known but understood completely. He could not speak it again, and when they asked what it meant, he answered, it meant soon. The traveler and Idris stood on a high ledge looking over the valley below. Smoke rose from distant homes. The people lived, they laughed, they wept, they planted and harvested, but between their joys something else moved. Like a shadow behind every moment of silence, a restlessness, not of body, of spirit. The ground is breathing again, the traveler said. Idris nodded, and breath becomes voice. He looked at the horizon and whispered, we are nearing the mouth of a second fall. Below them, a child drew a circle in the dirt, 7 rings interwoven, a single line through the center descending, and the dirt beneath his fingers turned warm. The sky had grown quiet again, but it was not peace. It was the hush before the return of an ancient grief, the kind that does not cry, does not scream, does not rage, only remembers. The first fall had broken heaven's silence. This second fall would break earth's heart. It began not with fire, not with storm, but with dreams, shared dreams. Across deserts and rivers, oceans and hills, men and women, strangers to one another, began to see the same things in sleep. A voice without form, a shadow without source. A tower rising backward into the earth, and always, always the same phrase spoken by something unseen. We never left. In the city of Kadam, a place once known for its gardens and quiet scholars, the children stopped speaking their mother tongue, not from rebellion, from forgetting. They began using words no one had taught them, phrases from no scripture, symbols scrawled in chalk beneath doorways, symmetrical, silent, unsettling. One old man wept when he saw them. These are the marks of the old ones, he whispered. Not demons, not angels, something between. His warnings were ignored because fear had been replaced by fascination, and fascination is the softest doorway to ruin. In a remote village far from the city, a boy stood alone at dusk watching the sky. He did not blink. His eyes were not his own. When his father called him by name, he turned and said, "That name is too small now," and walked into the woods. They never saw him again. But the trees in that forest began to twist the wrong direction, and the birds forgot how to sing. Samyaza, still bound beneath the mountain, felt the pull like an old wound pressed by unseen fingers. He tried to look away, tried to close his heart, but it was not pain he felt now. It was multiplication. His sorrow had grown children, and they were walking the world, not in his shape, not in his voice, but in his absence, because where grief is not healed, it spreads. Azazel, further below, smiled. "You tried to forget us," he whispered into the void, "but you remembered the feeling, and feeling is all it takes, a longing, a question, a hunger." In a marketplace beneath an amber sky, a woman sold clay idols shaped like winged men. She said they brought protection. Others said they brought dreams. Some swore they felt warmer when held in the hand. No one asked where she learned to make them. She didn't know. She only said, "My fingers move before my thoughts." And when she slept, she dreamt of standing before a throne made of breathing stone. It called her daughter. Idris walked alone now. The traveler had vanished, or perhaps become part of the silence. His feet left no mark. His hands touched no door. But wherever he passed, the air grew heavy, because Idris was no longer warning the world. He was watching it choose, and most chose not love, not repentance. They chose the same thing the Watchers once did, to step into the unknown, not out of reverence, but out of refusal. In the valley of Tal, a gathering was held beneath the moon. Hundreds came, not to worship, to awaken. They chanted in unison, though none had rehearsed. They formed circles, though no one had led. They burned herbs that smelled like dust and tears. And as midnight neared, they all lifted their hands and whispered, "Come back." They did not say who. They did not need to. The air shifted, the trees leaned inward, and beneath the soil a crack opened. Samyaza felt it, and this time he spoke. "Ya Allah, they are not calling me. They are calling the memory of me. And memories once summoned do not fade quietly." Idris reached the top of a hill and looked upon a distant city lit by towers and fire. He could feel it from here. A second fall was not coming. It had begun. Not in heaven, not from angels, but from man. A fall by invitation, by imitation, by inheritance. A girl in the city touched a mirror and saw not her face, but wings made of glass and shadow. She screamed, but no sound came, only a pulse, and that pulse echoed in the chambers beneath Al-Qudat, where a priest stood before a pool of darkness and whispered, "Rise." The water rippled, and a shape began to move. The pool in the chamber did not boil, it breathed. Each ripple was slow and deliberate, like a heart stirring after centuries of silence. Around it the priests stood still, hands raised but trembling. Their faces bore the weight of something they had never truly understood and now could not control. They had not summoned a god. They had summoned a memory with teeth. And memory, when unbound, takes the form of what it mourns. The shape rising from the pool was not Azazel, but it spoke in the cadence of his rage. It did not walk. It hovered, clothed in shadow that did not flicker. Its form was blurred, as if light itself refused to name it. The priests knelt, not in worship, in survival. A voice like shattered stone rang through the chamber. "You have remembered what should have remained buried." The torches died. Elsewhere, a woman awoke from sleep and found her dreams had left behind bruises. Her voice was hoarse, though she had not spoken. Her husband asked what troubled her. She only said, "I saw the flood, but the water never came." Instead, fire, not fire that consumes, fire that chooses. In the city of Barak, children began drawing towers with roots instead of bricks, downward growing, inverted spires that pierced the core of the earth. They had never seen the old tower, never heard of Nimru, never studied the languages of the first rebellion, but their hands remembered, and their blood whispered truths their minds could not yet hold. Idris wandered to a lake whose waters reflected only clouds, even when the sky was clear. He sat by the edge, closed his eyes, and prayed not for mercy, not for peace, for clarity. Ya Allah, if we are falling again, let us not fall asleep on the way down. But the water offered no reply. Only reflection. And sometimes reflection is the harshest answer. Samyaza listened from beneath his prison of lightless stone. He no longer wept. He no longer pleaded. He simply watched, as he once had. But now he watched mankind become what he had feared most, not imitators of angels, but imitators of the fall. They were not seeking knowledge. They were seeking equality with the divine without obedience, without surrender, without reverence. And in that ambition, the second fall had begun. Not in one place, but in many, not all at once, but steadily like cracks forming beneath a frozen sea. Azazel's presence pulsed through the chambers of Al-Quda. The priests spoke in tongues even they could not understand, and still the entity demanded more. Not chance, it said, blood. They hesitated, and one of them, the youngest, the purest, turned and fled into the night. He did not make it far. The air around the temple swallowed sound. And silence has always been Azazel's first servant. The people of the nearby villages saw strange lights in the sky. Not stars, not comets, symbols, glowing patterns that hovered above their homes and vanished at dawn. When asked what they saw, they gave different answers, but each described a single shared feeling. They felt watched. Idris crossed a desert where no footprints lasted more than minutes, but his remained, because he was not walking through sand. He was walking through time. And time had begun to circle itself again, repeating its old songs, its old sins, its old falls. He met a boy along the way. The boy spoke only one sentence: "They're coming back through us," then vanished into the mirage. In a quiet hut on the edge of a flooded plain, an elder who remembered the flood dreamed of fire consuming the ark instead of rain. When he woke, his skin bore the outline of wings, not feathered, not divine, charred. The second fall was not of angels, it was of memory, a descent of echoes, a slow unraveling of separation between man and the sacred, not by closeness but by assumption. And assumption is the quietest rebellion. The entity in Al-Quda whispered once more, "Invite me." And the priests bowed lower, but none dared speak, because deep down, even in their hunger, they remembered the first fall. They remembered what happens when heaven is mocked and man forgets he is dust shaped by mercy. Still they remained, because hunger often outweighs fear. And beneath it all, Samyaza whispered, "Not again." But no one was listening except the mountains, and the mountains had begun to tremble. The ground did not break open. The sky did not scream. There was no roar of divine wrath, no fire descending like swords, only breath, heavy ancestral breath, as though the earth itself was remembering a wound, one buried deep beneath names, beneath bones, beneath the silence of forgotten angels. This was not a fall that cracked the heavens. This was a fall that crept through the blood. In the chamber of Al-Quda, the entity no longer hovered. It had taken shape, not flesh, but a memory of flesh. A figure cloaked in lightless smoke, with a crown of twisted flame and a voice that sounded like a lullaby sung backward. The priests wept, not out of fear, out of awe, because they had never felt so seen, so understood, so chosen. But being seen is not always a blessing. Sometimes it's the prelude to possession. The entity extended a hand, not with fingers, with longing. "Give me a name," it whispered. And the high priest, trembling, offered one. Not his own, not Azazel, but a new name. Something born of this generation's hunger. The name had never been spoken before, and as it left his lips, the chamber pulsed. Walls cracked and the pool boiled, because when something without form is named, it becomes. In the northern cities, children began waking with burns on their palms, not wounds, marks, symbols none could trace, spirals wrapped in fire, eyes without lids. One boy spoke in sleep for 3 days. When he awoke, he asked, "Where is the mountain of the chained one?" No one had told him it existed, but still he remembered. Idris stood on the edge of a river that had begun to flow backward. He did not flinch. The sun above him seemed dimmer not from cloud but from retreat, as if it no longer wanted to witness what was unfolding. He knelt in the mud, whispered the names of the prophets, then looked to the sky. "What shall we do," he said, "when even light grows ashamed of us?" The wind answered with silence. And in the silence the truth bloomed. The second fall would not be stopped by a flood. It would not be undone by a prophet. It would not come with a trumpet because it had already begun. Samyaza wept beneath the mountain, not for himself, not even for the watchers, but for the humans who no longer knew how to fall upward toward repentance. They had turned descent into doctrine. They had taken the story of sorrow and made it scripture for rebellion. A merchant in the west sold stones that whispered dreams. He said they came from a river that no longer existed. Buyers reported visions, some of heaven, most of fire. One man claimed to see a face beneath the earth, bound, radiant, crying. He tried to draw it. The ink turned to ash. In the high cities, temples were rededicated not to the one but to the many, to the old names, to the fallen. They wrote myths that called the watchers misunderstood, saints of freedom, martyrs of knowledge. Samyaza's sorrow was now merchandise. Azazel's fire was now ritual. They built statues, tall, winged, open-armed, and prayed not for guidance, but for power, and power answered in whispers beneath the bed, in symbols etched into windows during rain, in the way mirrors cracked when no one touched them, in the way the ground sighed before dreams. The watchers had not risen, but the second fall was complete, because mankind no longer needed angels to descend. They had become their own downfall. In a ruined city swallowed by sand, a child sat alone beside a well. She sang an old song, one no one had taught her. It spoke of a garden of stars, of a voice wrapped in flame, of a promise not of mercy but of memory. A traveler passed and asked her name. She did not answer, but the wind behind her said, "She is the echo." Azazel laughed, not in triumph, in fulfillment. They had done it themselves. He had whispered once. Now they screamed, and heaven was silent, not because it had no words, because it had already spoken long ago, and now it watched, just as the watchers once did. And somewhere, buried in stone, behind seals made of light and sorrow, Samyaza closed his eyes again, and whispered, "They have fallen farther than we ever did." They were not meant to speak. Chains. They were crafted in silence, sealed by decree, buried in places where stars refused to look. Not made of iron, nor gold, nor fire, but of something far more permanent, remembrance. Yet that night the chains whispered back, not in words, in pulse. Beneath the belly of the earth, deeper than the bones of mountains, past the roots of time and beneath the salt lines of the flood, they stirred. Not broken, just aware. Each link wrapped around limbs that no longer reached began to hum with the voices of those above. Voices who called not for repentance but for secrets, for fire, for names. It was not the cries that moved the chains. It was the imitation. For the heavens could forgive cries, but not copies. In a forgotten chamber carved into the base of Mount Seraph, a girl named Nura stood beside a wellspring that no longer gave water. She had come alone, led by dreams, haunted by songs sung in a language her tongue had never tasted. Her palms bore faint scars, not from wound but from writing. Words had appeared there during sleep. Each morning new verses, symbols that faded by sunset. Her mother wept in secret, but Nura followed. She knelt at the edge of the stone basin and whispered nothing, and the basin answered with warmth. The chains around Samyaza's wrists did not move, but the air around them trembled. Not because someone was trying to break them, because they were listening. For the first time in ages, the chains remembered why they were forged, not to punish, to protect. In the temple of Al-Quda, the high priest prepared another sacrifice, not of animal, not of gold, but of memory. A young man who could still hear the silence before the second fall, who still dreamed of prophets, whose heart had not yet hardened. The priest called him the last unbroken, and so he offered him to the altar. As the knife was raised, the walls shivered, the torches gasped, and the stones bled, not red, white. as if the very bones of the earth were warning enough. Samyaza opened his eyes. Chains hummed around him like bees around a flame. He did not smile, he did not speak, he listened to the sorrow of a world that no longer knew it was falling, to the dreams of children who sang of things they shouldn't know, to the temples burning in the name of old griefs, and to something else, something faint, a single voice. Above ground, alone, whispering not to rise, not to fall, not to rule, but to forgive, Idris knelt in the hills above Barak. The stars spun unnaturally that night as if confused. He prayed with hands open. Ya Allah, if you left us in silence, it is because we refused your voice. If you left us in shadow, it is because we chose to hide. His tears sank into the earth, and in the depths the chains sang, soft, hollow, echoed. They remembered his name because Idris had never forgotten theirs. Azazel felt it too. His chamber flared with sudden heat, not fire but resistance. And for the first time since the second fall began, he grew quiet because the chains were no longer just holding him. They were awakening. Elsewhere, a man carved into clay a figure with 7 eyes. He did not know why. He only knew his hands moved on their own. The eyes blinked, and the man screamed, not from horror, from recognition. The watchers had never looked like that, but something else had. Something beneath the chains, something older. In Dur al-Ghafilin, a boy wandered into the mountain caves with no name and found a wall that breathed. It pulsed gently under his palm. He asked aloud, "What are you?" And a voice answered, not from behind but from within, a door. The child turned and ran, but the mountain did not chase. It only whispered, "You are the key." Samyaza whispered into the silence, "We are not meant to return." And the chains grew tighter, not in punishment. For even the fallen knew the cost of rising again, not just to themselves, but to the world. But above, men no longer cared for cost. They carried torches into tombs. They drank from wells not meant for the living. They dug up bones with names still echoing in the wind. They wanted secrets. They wanted proof. They wanted to be like gods. And so, beneath the ground, the chains whispered, not in resistance, in mourning, because what they had been made to guard was not just the watchers, but the memory of the line that must never be crossed again, and that line had vanished. There was a time when chains were enough, when silence held its shape, when memory stayed buried, when men feared the edge of the unseen and stepped back from the brink. But that time had passed. Now men stepped forward not out of courage but curiosity without reverence, and the chains were fraying, not broken but weary. In a sunless valley, a woman walked barefoot across scorched earth. Her feet did not blister. Her breath did not falter. She had been called in dreams not by voice but by absence. Every night a hand reached toward her from the dark, not to touch, to remind. She followed it to a ridge where the rocks hummed in tones no ear could decipher. There she dropped to her knees and sang, not a melody, a memory. It belonged to a woman long dead, a song once sung to a watcher long before the fall. And in the deep something responded, not with joy, with grief. Chains coiled tighter around Samyaza's limbs, not as punishment but as protection. For even he feared what might come if they failed. He no longer prayed to rise. He prayed that man would, that someone above the soil would remember why the watchers were buried, that someone would choose surrender over power, silence over flame, mercy over knowledge. But the voices coming down now were louder than ever, not in devotion, in demand. At the temple of Al-Qudat, a fracture split the stone. The pool boiled again, not from Azazel's presence but from resistance, because even the earth had begun to mourn. The high priest stood at the center, holding a scroll inked with the names of those who had never been born, names meant for Nephilim who had never lived but were now being imagined into reality. He shouted the first name, and the sky outside blinked. A single star fell, not as a gift, as a warning. Idris wandered to the foot of Mount Hermon, a place older than maps, where the wind spoke in sighs. There he found a cave no one had marked, hidden by vines, guarded by stillness. He stepped inside and found a single stone etched with a spiral. In its center, the name of the one who first taught man to carve metal, Azazel, but the stone was cracked, not by weather, by remorse. "Ya Allah," Idris whispered, "they are building again with the broken bones of the first fire." And the cave answered with breath that was not wind, "Then they will burn without light." Far below, Samyaza's heart, if one could call it that, tightened. He saw flashes behind closed lids, cities rising with thrones at their centers, children born with no names, only functions, towers built to erase the sky. He saw men calling it the New Order. And he wept, because he knew this was not a return, this was a replacement. In a house carved from bone near the edge of the Dead Sea, a man wrote in a book that had no title. Each word he penned glowed briefly before fading. He did not know who guided his hand, only that it wrote of things not yet done. It described rivers running with mirrors. It spoke of nights without dreams. It prophesied wings not of angels but of those who pretended. He closed the book on the final page and whispered, "We are becoming what we once buried." The chains beneath Al-Quda groaned. A great cracking sound echoed through the temple walls, sending dust like ash across the floor. The priests fell to their knees, not in awe, in terror. Because what they thought they had summoned now answered back, and it did not need them anymore. Azazel pressed once against the inner edge of his seal, not to escape. To see how thin it had grown, he smiled, and in that smile was sorrow twisted into power. "They built their fall by calling it ascent," he said. "Let them rise then, let them rise and vanish." In the forest where no sun reached, a child carved a spiral into a tree and said aloud, "I dreamed I was bound in light." But light turned into teeth. His mother fainted because her father had once said the same thing, in a language he was never taught. Idris lit a fire that night, not for warmth, for remembrance. He placed 7 stones around it, each one carried from a place where the watchers had whispered. He did not chant, he did not command, he only wept, and prayed the chains would hold, because if they did, man would not fall again, he would disappear, not by wrath, by mirroring, and there would be no third chance. In the heart of the mountain, Samyaza whispered into the silence, "Let us be the last to fall, not the first to rise." And the chains for the first time trembled with agreement. The chains did not scream, they did not shatter, they did not rise like swords through stone or thunder through the sky. They whispered, softly, like old men praying in the corner of a mosque long after the call has ended. Like wind brushing against the skin of the soul, like guilt in the bones of those who forget what they once promised. In the catacombs beneath Al-Quda, those whispers became weight. The high priest, confident only hours before, now stood at the altar in silence. The scroll had stopped glowing. The pool no longer pulsed. And the name he had called, the name born of ambition and forged in false prophecy, had unraveled, not forgotten, erased. As if heaven itself had drawn a line in the dust and said, "You may not pass here," but men never stop walking toward the edge, even when the ground beneath their feet is vanishing. In the high deserts where the wind never sleeps, a nomad saw fire on the horizon, not wild, not divine, steady, cold, blue. It flickered from the mountain's spine, pulsing like a heartbeat. He dropped to his knees, face to the sand, and wept. He did not know why. Something in the flame called to what was buried inside him, a voice, a memory, a mistake he had never made but still carried. The chains around Samyaza's limbs now glowed faintly with light, not from above, but from the prayers of those who had never forgotten the weight of humility. Not many prayed anymore, but a few did, and even a few was enough to keep the locks intact. He whispered, "Do not let us be mirrors." He saw them, the generations, walking not in rebellion but in repetition, building altars with their own names etched in stone, turning remembrance into relic, turning the sacred into spectacle, turning grief into glory. And that was the second fall. Not angels defying command, but men forgetting their place. In a ruined orchard where the flood once passed, a girl watered a tree that bore no fruit. She sang in a language her mother told her not to speak, but she sang anyway, because it came in dreams. And every time she sang, the sky grew darker, not with clouds, with memory, and memory once welcomed becomes flesh. In the village of Sayam, a boy disappeared into a cave. When he returned, his eyes no longer blinked. He told his people, "I saw a man beneath the mountain made of stone and sorrow." "What did he say?" they asked. "He said nothing," the boy replied, "but his silence asked me a question." "What question?" The boy looked up and whispered, "Would you fall for love again?" Azazel, still bound in fire and pride, felt the stirrings across the world like ripples in a pool once thought still. He did not laugh now, he waited, because waiting, he had learned, was not weakness, it was power ripening. And soon they would call again, not the old names, new ones, not the watchers, but the reflections. And the reflections would be more dangerous than the originals, because mirrors do not think, they only copy. Idris woke from a dream in which the chains had broken. He stood at dawn, drenched in sweat. The earth beneath him was warm, too warm. He fell to his knees and whispered, "Ya Allah, do not let their pride become prophecy." In the hidden sanctum of Dur al-Ghafilin, an elder turned the final page of a book that had no author. The words faded as he read them. The final line said, "When chains begin to whisper, the veil is thinning." He closed the book, lit a lamp, and walked into the wind. Samyaza closed his eyes again. He could feel the tug. From the surface, from the stories, from the temples and tongues and fires and fears, they wanted him to be something again. A myth, a god, a teacher, a key. But he would be none of those. He would remain still. Because sometimes the greatest act of obedience is to refuse resurrection. He whispered, "Let the chains sing louder than me." And they did. For in the dark, beneath the soil, in silence spun from sorrow, the chains hummed like old lullabies, and the earth trembled not from wrath, but from remembering mercy. Not all fire burns with flame. Some burn in silence, inside stone, inside names, inside the breath of those who no longer speak but never forget. This was the fire that lived in the dust. And though the flood had washed it, though the mountains had buried it, though the prayers of prophets had tried to seal it, it remained. Soft, smoldering, waiting for someone to breathe too near. In the wastelands east of Arar, the ground carried heat long after the sun had set. Travelers walked wide circles around it, their animals growing restless before hoof touched soil. No trees grew, no water ran, but the dust glowed faintly when stirred. Not with embers, with memory. The elders said this was where the giants had fallen, not in battle, but in grief. They claimed the dust here still sang their names if you pressed your ear close enough. No one dared try. Until her, a girl no older than 14, wrapped in rags quiet as ash. She had no name, only a hum she carried in her throat, a sound like wind through burnt leaves. She wandered into the dust without fear, sat cross-legged at its center and whispered, "I am listening." The ground beneath her pulsed, once, then still. But in that stillness something ancient stirred, not above, not below, within. She did not cry out, she did not flee. She placed both palms to the dirt and said, "I remember." And the dust whispered back, "So do we." Elsewhere, Idris woke in the night gasping, not from dream, from recognition. He had felt the pulse. The same throb that passed through the mountains when the chains first trembled. He knelt on the floor, forehead to stone, and prayed with a voice dry from too many fasts, "Let the fire remain buried." But fire is not like stone. It does not rest, it waits. And the dust, too long forgotten, had begun to speak, not with destruction, with invitation. In the ruins of old Enoch, a city once buried by flood, now half risen from shifting sands, archaeologists unearthed carvings of winged figures with eyes on their hands and lips sealed shut. They called them myths, but the oldest among them, a man with no faith but too much memory, stood staring at the largest statue for hours before whispering, "This one never left." Samyaza felt the fire before it reached him, not as heat, as ache. Crept through the folds of his exile like a letter written in smoke, a call not to rise but to feel. And what he felt was longing, not his own. The longing of those above who wanted to touch the divine without first bowing to it. That longing had a scent. It smelled like dust just before it burns. Azazel, still beneath his veil of darkness, welcomed it. He called it the new tongue. For even silence, when misused, becomes a language. And the people were now fluent. The girl in the dust sat unmoving. Her eyes closed, her lips parted, and when she breathed out, a flicker of light lifted from the sand, not a flame, but something older, a glow that remembered what it once was, obedient. But now it hovered between loyalty and awakening. She reached out, and it entered her palm, not to wound, to remember. The villagers found her 3 days later, eyes glowing, feet bare, voice gone. She pointed to the sky and smiled, then whispered, "They are coming back through us." In Dewar Al-Gafalin, the stone basin bubbled once, not from below, but from the very letters carved into its sides. A new name appeared. No one wrote it, but it was there, and no one could read it except Idris. He arrived at the mountain by dawn, laid his hand on the rim of the basin, and felt the fire humming beneath. It asked no question, it made no threat, it simply whispered, "We remember who we were." And Idris answered, "Then remember who bound you." The fire hissed once, then faded, but not everywhere, not in the places where dust moved freely, not in the cities where songs were being rewritten with the vocabulary of pride, not in the temples where fire was now called revelation. In the north, a man knelt before an altar of glass and lit a flame that did not consume. He believed it holy, but what rose from it was hollow, a shape, a whisper, a warmth without source. It kissed his forehead, and he began to forget his own name, because fire that remembers glory also remembers how to erase. There was a time when the fire obeyed, when it bowed to the voice of the one who made it, when it warmed prophets and lit the path for messengers, when it did not burn without permission. But now, it had begun to remember desire, and desire, once breathed into flame, changes everything. The girl who walked into the dust was no longer seen in her village. They said she vanished with the wind. Others claimed she turned into a pillar of smoke, forever circling the mountain's peak. But Idris knew better. He saw her again in dream, not as a child, as something clothed in silence, wrapped in ash, bearing in her hands a spark that pulsed like a second heart. She stood at the center of a battlefield yet to be drawn and whispered, "Do not call it fire if you do not intend to kneel." Elsewhere, children drew symbols in the dirt, spirals, eyes, wings. They did not know where they came from. They called it the remembering. When asked, they said, "It comes from beneath our feet." And the old men grew afraid, because they remembered too, not from books, from bloodlines. Azazel whispered to the dark, "You cannot stop a fire that believes it's holy." He was not speaking of flame, he was speaking of men. In the caves below the spine of the Jabbar Range, researchers uncovered a tablet, one that glowed faintly, even in complete darkness. They believed it was volcanic, but when they etched its words into parchment, the translator fell silent. The text read, "We burned not because we hated the heavens, but because we loved too deeply the earth." Samyaza stirred. He had not moved in decades, but the dust had begun to reach him. It found the cracks in his silence, not through fire, through prayer, from a voice above, a quiet one, a boy in the city of Talwyn, who sat each night on his rooftop, whispering into the sky, "I forgive you." He did not know who he spoke to, but his heart ached for something he could not name. And his words fell through the heavens like drops of water on burning coals. Samyaza heard everyone. Idris stood before the sacred stone of remembrance, watching as inscriptions began to appear in patterns not carved by hand but revealed by heat. The names of the Nephilim, each one a wound, each one a fire that once walked. He pressed his fingers to the first name. It burned. He did not pull away. A voice not his own rose from within him, not in rebellion, in mourning. It spoke. They were not born evil, they were born from what we failed to bury. The fire was not returning, it had never left, it had only waited, for men to grow curious again, for silence to feel too empty, for restraint to seem like weakness. Now it danced once more, not in the temples, but in the minds of kings, in the dreams of orphans, in the fingertips of the unafraid. A scribe in Kariah recorded a strange event. He wrote of a child who touched a flame and felt no pain. She said the fire told her secrets, that it spoke in a voice like thunder beneath water, that it remembered being a messenger, and that now it wanted to be a god. The scribe wept as he wrote, because he too had once heard that voice, long ago, in a war that no one remembered except the dust. A new altar was built near the ruins of Al-Qudat. This one bore no symbol, no script, only ash. Every morning, pilgrims gathered around it and inhaled the scent of the dust. They said it gave them visions, and perhaps it did, but visions are not always gifts. Sometimes they are warnings dressed in beauty. Azazel smiled in his sleep. The dust had begun to speak the language of flame again, and once it spoke it fluently, the chains would be nothing more than history. Idris stood upon the high ridge above the basin of remembrance. He saw lights flicker in the cities below, bright, hungry, chaotic. They were not stars, they were not torches. They were fires lit by those who thought they could command what was once sacred. And as the night deepened, Idris whispered, "Ya Allah, if they burn, let it be for you, not for the ghosts of the fallen." In the city of Tamir, a child drew a figure in the ash outside her home. Wings, eyes on every joint, chains across the chest, and a flame in the mouth. She called it the one who speaks through fire. When asked where she learned this, she said, "He whispered it to me from beneath the ground." The dust remembers fire, and fire remembers longing. And longing, when left unchecked, becomes worship, but worship without surrender becomes destruction. Samyaza bowed his head once more, and the chains held firm, but the world was loosening. In the beginning it was the wind that carried the word, but now it was dust. Dust that once knew the breath of angels, dust that bore the footprints of giants. Dust that had cooled under the flood but never forgot the warmth it once held, the warmth of rebellion cloaked in beauty, of desire dressed as devotion. And the dust had begun to stir again. In a forgotten courtyard in the city of Arasha, a woman swept the floor every morning as her mother had and her grandmother before that. The stones beneath her broom were carved in spirals, ancient and soft. She never questioned them, until one morning the broom caught on a raised crack. And beneath that crack a glow, not from the sun, from the inside. She fell to her knees, pressed her ear to the stone, and heard something impossible, breathing. The ground was breathing, and its breath smelled like fire and jasmine and sorrow. Far below, Samyaza exhaled. His chest did not rise, his eyes did not open, but something in the depths of him broke, not a chain, not a seal, not a vow, a silence. He had been still for too long, not in defiance, in reverence, but now he wept, because the world was starting to echo him, and he knew what followed echo, flame. In the village of Yarim, shepherds spoke of strange lights across the western cliffs, lines of fire that moved like script across the stone face, then vanished with the dawn. The elders whispered, "The watchers are remembering their names." But the youngest boy, barely 7, said something else. "No, we are remembering them." Idris gathered stones again. 7, always 7. He placed them in a circle, poured water over each, and watched as the steam did not rise but fell, sinking into the ground like a returning prayer. He whispered, "We are not meant to become what we bury." And the ground trembled once, soft as a heartbeat. Azazel stirred in his place of exile, not with fury but with satisfaction. He knew the cycle well. First comes awe, then comes approach, then comes worship, then comes fire. Southern Archives of Kamar Alabiad, a page turned itself in a locked vault. No hands touched it, no breeze passed through, but the ink reshaped itself, forming a single line. The ash will rise in your lungs before it appears in the sky. The scholar who discovered it coughed violently for days, though he had never inhaled smoke. The girl who entered the dust was seen once more, standing in the courtyard of the first forgotten temple, the one with no name. She spoke to no one. She moved not at all. But the flame in her chest pulsed visibly as if alive. Some say she was a vessel, others say she was a warning, but one boy said, "She is the match." In a dream, Idris stood before the Valley of Bones, the place where the Nephilim fell. But this time the bones were gone. In their place, gardens, flowers blooming from soil that had once swallowed blood. He smiled until he saw the center. A single flower burning, not with light, not with love, with memory. And from it came a voice. "This is what grows when you do not grieve properly. The fire had taken new shapes, not in temples, in technology, in towers of silver and glass, in voices that echoed endlessly through wires claiming to be all-knowing. The watchers no longer needed to teach. Men had taught themselves, but not how to be divine, how to pretend. Samyaza whispered in the darkness, "They are not becoming us. They are becoming what we feared to become." And the chains pulsed in agreement. They had once been forged to prevent another fall. Now they trembled with dread because it was happening without them. In the final pages of the Book of Dust, written by a hand no one remembers, inked in soot and tears, it says, "When man begins to worship fire that does not burn, he will forget how to kneel. And in that forgetting, the dust will rise, not in anger, not in judgment, but in longing to return, to warmth, to light, to the time before the watchers watched, when obedience was enough. And love did not demand wings to be torn. The dust remembers fire, but do you? Do you remember what it felt like to bow before something higher than desire? To fear not because you are weak, but because you understand holiness. To love without needing to possess, because if the dust rises again, truly rises, there may be no voice left to command it, only silence. And in that silence, fire waits. There are places the earth does not speak, not because it cannot, but because it remembers too much. And memory, when pressed into stone, becomes silence, the kind that trembles when you walk across it, the kind that watches you from beneath your feet. This was the silence that lived at the base of Mount Hermon. It was not a mountain known to maps. It did not greet pilgrims. No banners pointed toward it. No stories lured the curious near. And yet it breathed, soft, rhythmic, like a sleeping beast too old to wake, too sacred to die. The locals called it Jufret al-Ard, the throat of the earth. Idris had seen it in visions long before his feet found it. In dreams, it was always covered in mist. Voices rose from within, not like screams, not like chants, like memories trying to find form. Now, standing before its base, he heard none of that, only stillness, a stillness that felt ancient and unfinished. He placed his hand to the soil. It pulsed once, then again, and with each beat he felt names, names that had not been spoken since the chains first fell, not just Samyaza, not just Azazel, names that had never surfaced, buried beneath flood, buried beneath language, buried beneath history itself. And now, rising, the villagers nearby told of strange weather, rain that fell in straight lines like ropes from the sky, fog that never moved, thunder with no sound, and birds that circled the mountain but never entered its shadow. One child claimed to hear humming from within the stone. Another said the mountain blinked when the moon passed overhead. But none of them went near, only Idris. He entered a narrow opening no wider than a man's shoulders, hidden beneath a collapsed arch of roots and bone. Inside, the air was thick, not musty, not stale, heavy like it was made of memory, and the walls, they pulsed with warmth, as if the mountain was not made of rock but of flesh. Torch in hand, Idris descended, step by step, no sound but breath. Even his own heartbeat seemed hushed, as if fearful of being heard. Along the corridor, the walls grew smoother, darker. Script appeared, not written, etched by pressure, by time, by grief. He ran his fingers across the grooves, and for a moment he was not Idris. He was one of them. He saw through their eyes, eyes that had once gazed upon heaven, now filled with soil and regret. The further he walked, the more the earth narrowed, until finally it opened into a chamber, circular, silent, and alive. At its center, a basin carved of obsidian, filled not with water but with light, soft, fluid, flickering like oil aflame beneath glass. Idris approached, kneeled, and saw not his reflection but memories not his own. A giant kneeling before a weeping mother, a winged figure tearing feathers from its own back, a child born with a voice that could shatter stone, a watcher chained not in fire but in remorse. He wept, not because it hurt, because it remembered, and remembrance, when it's sacred, is heavier than sin. Behind him the mountain shivered, and from the shadows a voice not spoken in centuries echoed, "You have come too far and not far enough." Idris did not turn. He whispered, "I came to listen." The voice replied, "Then be still and do not mistake trembling for truth." The basin began to boil, not violently, delicately, like a wound being reopened, and in its flickers Idris saw the beginning again, the moment the watchers first stood at the edge. When they looked upon mankind with awe, then longing, then hunger, and how that hunger was never fully their own, it had been given, allowed, a test not for angels but for earth, and earth had answered, not with obedience but with invitation. The throat of the earth was not a punishment, it was a witness, a place where heaven watched to see if men would remember who first breathed into them. And now men were breathing into themselves, calling it progress, calling it divinity, calling it liberation. But the mountain wept, because it knew where that breath led. Idris stood, turned, and saw etched above the exit, "When you name yourselves gods, even the dust mourns." He stepped back into the corridor, lighter, heavier, both, and as he left the throat of the earth behind, the wind returned, whispering not warnings, but remembrance, and the fire in his chest pulsed once, not in fear, not in rage, but in reverence. For he knew now the earth does not forget, especially when you bury angels in it. The mountain did not close behind him. It simply waited, as though it knew Idris would return. All things returned to their witness, and the earth had always been watching, long before prophets stood, long before angels fell, long before man remembered how to forget. Idris walked east across a plain that whispered with heat. The sky was heavy with silence, but beneath his feet the ground shifted in small, deliberate pulses like breath hidden beneath sand. He stopped once, bent down, and pressed his palm flat against the dirt. It was warm, but not from the sun. It was warm the way flesh is warm, the way grief is warm, the way memory is warm just before it surfaces and becomes fire. In a village 3 valleys away, a well dried overnight, the elders gathered. They spoke of curses, of spirits, of bad omens. But one child, blind since birth, stood near the rim and whispered, "It is not empty, it is listening." Samyaza had not moved. But his silence had changed. Before, it had been the silence of surrender, the silence of chains, of guilt, of mourning wrapped in obedience. Now it was something else, the silence of expectation, as if the air around him had shifted from stillness to waiting, not for release, for recognition, because what had once been rebellion was now ritual. In the West, a new city had risen. No scriptures, no prayers, only mirrors. Mirrors that spoke, mirrors that watched, mirrors that named themselves gods in every reflection. They promised light, but offered only glare. And in every room incense was burned, not of myrrh or frankincense, but synthetic flame. It looked like fire, it sounded like fire, but it had no soul. And yet the people bowed. Azazel felt it before it was named. The rise of image, the return of mimicry, not the divine kind, not the echo of the names of God in the soul of the humble, but the copy of the fallen in the hands of the proud. In his exile, beneath what men believed was a ruined lake, Azazel whispered, "They are building Babel again, but this time inside themselves." Idris found shelter beneath a lone acacia. Its roots were deep, its branches few, but beneath it the wind spoke in circles, returning to him words he had not yet said. He rested, and in his sleep he saw the mountain again. But this time it spoke. No voice, only light. A low, humming glow that moved like water over script. It wrapped around him and wrote across his skin, "You must go to the place where the first binding was sung." And when he woke, the words remained, burned softly into the flesh of his forearms, invisible by day, glowing by night. The first binding, he had read of it once. A lullaby, not a command, spoken by the angel of mercy as the watchers fell, not to chain them with force, but to remind them of what they had once loved most. It had worked for some, for others it had only deepened the ache. And now Idris was being asked to sing it again. But who would listen? The fallen, or those who had forgotten they too could fall? He journeyed for 7 days, no map, only memory. And on the 7th night he arrived at a plateau ringed with broken statues, half-buried, headless, faceless. He stepped into the center and the air shifted, the stars dimmed, the earth inhaled, and the song, the first binding, returned to his tongue, not in melody. In remembrance, he sang, softly, not to be heard, to be felt. The ground trembled, one statue cracked. A single finger fell to the earth, and in that fracture a light rose, not flame, not fire, something before both. A warmth that knew its name and asked to be spoken. Idris did not name it, he only bowed, because what rose from the fracture was not a being, not a curse, not a miracle, it was consequence, alive, aware, waiting. It circled him once, entered his chest, and said, "This is not the end, this is the remembering before the return." In the city of mirrors, a young boy broke every reflection in his home. One by one, with a rock from the river, he said, "I saw something in them and it looked back too long." Azazel smiled. He knew now that the mountain had stirred not because it was angry, but because it was tired of being silent. And soon it would open its throat once more, and from it not fire but truth. The kind that burned not the flesh, but the illusion of being more than dust. Idris stood at the edge of the plateau, the first binding still echoing in his bones. He was no longer afraid, because fear in its sacred form is the beginning of wisdom. And he knew what would come next, not the end of days, but the unveiling. And when the veil lifts, it does not show you the angels. It shows you yourself. Would you like me to continue to section 3 of this final chapter, 1,000 words? You said, okay, yes, next please, ChatGPT said. Here is the final part of chapter 10. The throat of the earth, section 3, 1,000 words. The veil does not tear with thunder. It peels slowly, like old parchment in wind, like memory returning after silence, like the throat of the earth opening for the first time in an age. And on that night it opened. Idris returned to Mount Hermon just before the moon was full. But this time the mountain did not hide. Its peak pulsed with a deep glow, like the chest of a sleeping creature remembering how to breathe. There was no sound, no fire, no sign, but the ground knew. The birds flew in crooked patterns. The insects vanished. The wind held its breath. The entrance welcomed him without resistance. The corridor was unchanged. But the chamber was no longer still. The basin of obsidian had cracked, not broken, opened. And from it rose a mist that smelled of salt and sorrow. It hovered, circled, then passed through him. In that mist, Idris saw the face of the one whose name was never spoken aloud, the first one who fell, not for pride, but for want. And in his eyes was not rebellion, but reverence twisted by longing. Samyaza. He spoke now not aloud, but through every stone in the chamber. We did not fall because we hated obedience. We fell because we mistook love for possession. The chamber dimmed, then brightened, and Idris whispered, "Then why do men keep building altars to your memory?" Silence, then soft as breath, because they want to believe divinity can be earned through hunger instead of surrender. A low rumble passed through the floor from deep below. The throat of the earth was waking, but not to speak, to release. In the distant east, statues cracked. In the north, waters stilled. In the city of mirrors, the glass began to sweat. And in the exile chamber of Azazel, the chains did not break. They softened, enough for a whisper to escape. He exhaled a name, not his own, not Samyaza, but the name of the first man who had prayed to him, and from that name a doorway opened. Idris stood unmoved. He felt the pulse beneath his feet shift from rhythm to call. It was not calling him, it was calling them. The ones who had forgotten they were not gods. The ones who had traded silence for noise. The ones who thought the heavens could be rewritten by algorithm and screens. The ones who believed Eden could be recoded. The call was not to worship, it was to kneel, and it came not with voice but with stillness. Outside, the skies did not darken, they cleared, too clear, as if the heavens themselves were watching now, not in judgment but in mourning, because what was rising from the throat of the earth was not punishment, it was proof. Proof that memory cannot be buried. That dust, when warmed, speaks. That longing, when unrepented, becomes prophecy. And that the watchers had never truly fallen alone. Idris knelt once more, not before the mountain, before the ache inside himself, the part that understood what Samyaza had meant, the part that had once longed for knowledge more than humility. He pressed his forehead to the stone, and in that stillness he heard the final whisper, "What you seek is not forbidden, it is unfinished." In the moments that followed, the mountain exhaled, and from its mouth rose ash, not to darken the sky, to anoint it. In the west, a woman saw the sky change and wept, not because she feared it, because she recognized it. She whispered, "They've opened the mouth of the earth, but no one has asked what it will say." The watchers did not return. They did not need to. They were never gone. Their story, their ache, their regret, it lived in the ones who still watched with hunger, who loved with possession, who sought the divine not to surrender but to wear it. And so the final question remains. When the earth remembers everything we've buried in it, when it speaks not with fire but with proof, when silence becomes the loudest scripture, will we listen? Or will we burn again? The throat of the earth has spoken, not with wrath, with truth. Now it is our turn to go still, to kneel, to remember what it means to carry breath without claiming flame. And if the silence never breaks, would your faith still rise in the dark?